He sold my home while I was on the operating table, I said, watching my husband Derek load his golf clubs into Amber's Range Rover. You can't prove that, Elena, he laughed without turning around. Besides, the paperwork's already filed. I leaned against the doorframe, my incisions still tender, hiding a smile because he had no idea I'd quietly transferred the deed to my name 3 months earlier, or that Amber was secretly recording everything for my attorney. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun was barely breaking through the clouds as I watched Derek methodically arrange his designer golf bag in Amber's luxury SUV. My bathrobe pulled tightly around my still healing body, the chill in the air nothing compared to the ice in my veins. Just 7 days earlier, I had been wheeled into Riverside Memorial's operating room for a procedure that would remove a benign tumor. A health scare that apparently gave my husband the perfect opportunity to sell our home out from under me. At least wait until I've recovered before kicking me out, I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. Derek finally turned, his expression a practiced mix of pity and impatience that I'd grown too familiar with over our 12 years of marriage. The new owners are being generous letting you stay another 2 weeks, he replied, checking his watch, a Rolex I'd given him for our 10th anniversary. You should be thanking them, and me, for negotiating that courtesy period. Behind him, Amber slipped into the driver's seat, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, her expression carefully blank as she pretended not to listen. Where am I supposed to go after that? I asked, allowing a tremor into my voice. Derek shrugged, his tailored jacket shifting smoothly across his shoulders. Your sister's place in Columbus, maybe? Or rent something small. The housing market in Riverside Heights is expensive. But then, you know that now. He smiled, the same smile that once made my heart race, but now only revealed the stranger he'd become. I made sure the sale agreement included a small stipend for you, enough for a security deposit on an apartment. Call it compassionate separation. I forced myself to look wounded, vulnerable, exactly what he expected, as he climbed into the passenger seat beside Amber. As they backed down our cobblestone driveway, I raised my hand in a wave that could have been mistaken for a farewell, but was actually closer to goodbye to the man I thought I'd married, not the one driving away. The moment their taillights disappeared around the bend, I let the facade drop. Walking carefully back inside our 1920s Tudor-style home, my home, I pulled out my phone and sent a single text to Olivia. They've left. Time to proceed. The reply came almost instantly. On it, meeting at my office at 2 p.m. Bring the final bank statements. I made my way slowly to the kitchen, my body still tender from surgery, but my mind remarkably clear. Pouring a cup of coffee, I took a moment to absorb the morning stillness of Cedar Lane Estate. The house had stood for nearly a century, weathering storms both literal and figurative. It had belonged to Derek's grandfather originally, passed down with the understanding it would remain in the family. A legacy Derek had apparently been willing to discard for quick cash and a fresh start with his 28-year-old office manager. What he didn't know was that I'd been prepared for this moment for longer than he realized. I met Derek Rodriguez 15 years ago at a hospital fundraiser where his development company was being recognized for a major donation to our new pediatric wing. As Riverside Memorial's assistant administrator, I'd been tasked with ensuring the event ran smoothly. Derek had approached me toward the end of the evening, champagne flute in hand, his confidence magnetic. You're the only person here who hasn't tried to pitch me on something, he'd said, offering me a fresh glass of champagne. The night's still young, I'd replied with a small smile, accepting the drink but maintaining professional distance. He'd laughed then, genuine amusement crinkling the corners of his eyes. I'm Derek Rodriguez. I know who you are, Mr. Rodriguez. Your company's donation is building our new pediatric oncology floor. And you are? He persisted. Elena Vasquez, assistant hospital administrator. Not for long, I'm guessing, he said, studying me with interest. You seem overqualified for assistant anything. That night had been the beginning of a whirlwind romance that surprised everyone, including myself. At 38, I'd built a stable career and had stopped expecting a traditional family life. But Derek was persistent, charming, and seemingly transparent about his intentions. We'll be partners in every sense, he'd promised when proposing just 6 months later, sliding an antique emerald ring onto my finger. Equal in all things. Our wedding was intimate but elegant, held in the garden of his family home. The same Tudor house that would become the center of our current conflict. His mother had been gracious but reserved, a woman from old money who had raised Derek alone after his father's early death. The Rodriguez men are visionaries, she'd told me. During the reception, her eyes flickering between pride and warning. They see possibilities others don't. It's both their gift and their curse. I hadn't fully understood her meaning then. I would come to learn it painfully over the years that followed. The changes in our relationship were almost imperceptible, at first. Small suggestions about combining our finances for simplicity's sake. Casual remarks about how my hospital administration career was limiting my potential. By our 3rd anniversary, Derek had convinced me to leave my position and join his development company as operations director. A lateral move that he framed as an opportunity for us to build something together. Why work for someone else when we can create our own legacy? He'd reasoned, his enthusiasm infectious. I'd agreed, believing we were truly building together. What I didn't realize was that I was slowly being maneuvered into a position where my professional identity was entirely dependent on him. My name appeared on lower-level paperwork and day-to-day operations, but never on the major deals or financial documents. My role became increasingly ceremonial as Derek expanded the business. By our 7th anniversary, I was effectively working for my husband rather than with him. By our 10th, I was planning corporate events rather than corporate strategy. The partnership he'd promised had evolved into a carefully constructed hierarchy with Derek firmly at the top. When I received my diagnosis 4 months ago, a tumor that was thankfully benign but required significant surgery, Derek had seemed appropriately concerned. He'd accompanied me to appointments, asked questions of my doctors, and assured me he would handle everything while I recovered. Just focus on getting better, he'd said, squeezing my hand in the surgeon's office. I'll take care of all the details. What I didn't know then was which details he was planning to take care of. The first indication came 3 weeks before my surgery when I noticed Derek having intense phone conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room. Then there were the late nights at the office, the vague explanations about restructuring, deals, and the sudden interest in our home's property value. Just thinking about our future options, he'd said when I questioned him about calling an appraiser. With your health concerns, maybe we should consider downsizing to something more manageable. My health concern was a single, removable tumor, not a debilitating chronic condition. But his framing made my questions seem like evidence I wasn't thinking clearly. 2 weeks before my surgery, I discovered something that crystallized my growing suspicions. Derek had left his laptop open while taking a shower, and a notification appeared for an email with the subject line, Cedar Lane Estate, Offer Acceptance. I'd never invaded Derek's privacy before, but something, intuition perhaps, propelled me to click. The email contained a preliminary acceptance of an all-cash offer on our home from an investment company I'd never heard of. There was no mention of my name anywhere in the correspondence, despite the fact that I was supposedly co-owner of our property. The closing date was set for the day after my surgery. I closed the email and walked numbly to our bedroom, sitting on the edge of our king-sized bed as 15 years of marriage crystallized into one devastating realization. I had never been a partner. I had been an acquisition that had now depreciated in value. That night, after Derek had fallen asleep, I called the one person I knew I could trust implicitly, Olivia Chen, my college roommate turned family law attorney. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We hadn't spoken regularly in recent years, another casualty of the subtle way Derek had isolated me from my support network, but she answered on the second ring. "Elena, is everything okay?" Her voice, immediately alert despite the late hour, was like a lifeline. "No," I admitted, speaking softly from inside our guest bathroom with the shower running to cover my voice. "But I think it will be. Can we meet tomorrow?" The following morning, I told Derek I was going for pre-surgery testing. Instead, I met Olivia at the Copper Kettle, a small cafe far from Derek's usual haunts. As I detailed the situation, my pending surgery, the secret house sale, the gradual erosion of my role in both our marriage and business, Olivia's expression shifted from concern to cold determination. "Do you have access to your home's deed?" she asked, her legal mind immediately focusing on practical details. "I think so. Derek keeps important documents in his home office." "Get me a copy. Today, if possible," she said, making notes on her phone. "And your prenuptial agreement as well." I hesitated. "We don't have one. Derek said it would start our marriage on a foundation of distrust." Olivia's eyebrow raised slightly. "That's convenient for him. What about your inheritance? The money from your father?" 3 years earlier, my father had passed away, leaving me a modest but significant inheritance. Money that had mostly gone into renovating the east wing of our house, creating a modern kitchen and master suite while preserving the home's historic character. Most of it went into the house, I admitted. Derek said it was the smartest investment, building equity in a property we'd own forever. "What about the business? Are you legally part of Rodriguez Development?" "I'm on the paperwork as operations director, but..." I trailed off, the full extent of my vulnerability becoming clearer. "I'm not sure about my actual legal standing." Olivia tapped her pen against her coffee cup, thinking, "Here's what we're going to do. First, we gather information. All the documentation you can safely access without raising suspicion. Second, I'm bringing in Marcus Wilson from my firm. He specializes in property law." By the time I left the cafe, we had a plan, not just for addressing the immediate crisis of the house sale, but for protecting myself in the separation that now seemed inevitable. Over the next 10 days, I became a detective in my own marriage. While Derek was at work, I carefully photographed documents, downloaded financial records, and made copies of anything that might be relevant to establishing my legal claims. I discovered offshore accounts I'd never known existed, property holdings in 3 states, and evidence that the Rodriguez Development Group was facing financial pressures Derek had never disclosed. Most critically, I uncovered the source of that pressure: a high-risk investment scheme that had gone badly wrong. Derek had leveraged several properties, including our home, against a commercial development that had fallen through when environmental contamination was discovered on the site. The cash offer on our house wasn't a random opportunity. It was a desperate attempt to cover losses before they became public. I also learned the identity of the woman who'd been increasingly present in Derek's work life. Amber Collins wasn't just his office manager. Bank records showed large transfers to accounts in her name, weekend trips disguised as business conferences, and text messages that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. What surprised me most, however, was discovering that 6 months earlier, during what Derek had called estate planning updates, he had removed my name from our property's deed entirely. The house where we'd lived for a decade, which contained significant investment from my inheritance, was legally in his name alone. The discovery should have devastated me. Instead, it clarified my path forward. 3 days before my surgery, I met with Olivia and Marcus at their law office. "He's removed." "You from the deed entirely," Marcus confirmed, reviewing the documents I'd provided. "It's unusual and potentially fraudulent," especially considering your inheritance funds were invested in the property. Can we stop the sale? I asked. Marcus and Olivia exchanged glances. We could file an emergency injunction, Olivia began, carefully, but that would tip our hand. And with your surgery scheduled? There might be another approach, Marcus said, turning his laptop toward me. One that uses Derek's own tactics against him. The plan was audacious and required perfect timing. Rather than trying to stop the sale, we would execute a different strategy altogether, one that required quick action and absolute discretion. That afternoon, while Derek was in a meeting I knew would last hours, I visited our family bank with documentation Marcus had prepared. By leveraging my inheritance records and evidence of the home improvements funded by my money, I initiated a specific type of property claim that Marcus had identified as our best option. The next day, with Olivia accompanying me as both emotional support and legal representation, I signed papers that Marcus filed immediately with the county recorder's office. The timing was crucial. Our documents needed to be processed before the sale Derek had arranged could be completed. Are you sure about this? Olivia asked as we left the courthouse. Once we set this in motion, there's no going back to how things were. I thought about the husband who was planning to sell our home while I was unconscious in surgery, the years of subtle manipulation, the gradual erosion of my independence. I'm sure, I said. Even if this doesn't work, I can't go back to not seeing the truth. The morning of my surgery arrived. Derek drove me to Riverside Memorial, outwardly the picture of a concerned husband. He held my hand in pre-op, kissed my forehead before they wheeled me in, and promised to be there when I woke up. He wasn't, of course. As I later learned, he had gone directly from the hospital to the closing, signing away Cedar Lane Estate while I was still under anesthesia. By the time I was moved to recovery, he had received confirmation of the funds transfer and was already implementing the next phase of his plan, using a portion of the proceeds to stabilize his company's most pressing debts while transferring the remainder to accounts Amber had helped him establish. What he couldn't know, was that Marcus had orchestrated a completely legal maneuver based on property law precedents involving inheritance investments. 24 hours before Derek's closing, the county recorder had officially updated the property records to reflect my partial ownership based on my inheritance investment. And because of the specific type of claim filed, this update superseded any previous transfers Derek had arranged without my knowledge. Furthermore, Marcus had included a provision that, due to the documented history of my inheritance in the property, granted me first right of refusal on any sale. In essence, Derek had managed to sell something that wasn't entirely his to sell, and the transaction had a fatal flaw that would unravel his entire plan. But we let him believe he'd succeeded. For the week following my surgery, I played the role Derek expected, weak, confused, and entirely dependent on his decisions. He visited briefly each day, making a show of concern for the hospital staff, while subtly beginning to discuss my transition to a new living situation. I've found a nice apartment complex, he mentioned casually on my third day post-surgery. Very reasonable rates, and they have an elevator. Good for your recovery. I nodded weakly, asking only minimal questions, watching as he checked his watch repeatedly, clearly eager to return to whatever celebration he and Amber had planned. The day I was discharged, Derek arrived with Amber waiting conspicuously in the car. She's just giving me a ride, he explained unconvincingly. Her place was on the way. I said nothing about the lipstick on his collar or the fact that Amber lived in the opposite direction. For the next several days, I continued the performance, taking pain medication that made me drowsy, asking Derek to help with decisions I was perfectly capable of making and generally reinforcing his perception of me as someone overwhelmed by circumstances and grateful for his guidance. Meanwhile, Olivia, Marcus, and I finalized our strategy. The legal groundwork was in place. The evidence was secured. We needed only the right moment to reveal the truth. That moment came this morning, exactly 1 week after my surgery, when Derek announced he would be away on business for the weekend. I didn't mention that I knew Amber had booked a luxury suite at Blue Mountain Resort, or that she had used a credit card connected to an account funded with money from our house. Sele. Now, as I slowly climbed the stairs to change out of my bathrobe, I felt a strange combination of grief and liberation. The grief wasn't for Derek. That morning had begun months ago when I first recognized the extent of his betrayal. It was for the years spent believing in a partnership that had never truly existed. At precisely 2 p.m., I arrived at Olivia's office, the final bank statements in hand. Marcus was already there, along with Victor Patel, Derek's business partner, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Thank you for coming, Victor," I said, extending my hand. He had been the most difficult piece of our plan to secure, but also potentially the most valuable. "I'm still not sure about this," he said, accepting my handshake reluctantly. "Derek and I have been partners for 15 years. And in that time, has he ever made financial decisions without consulting you?" I asked. "Decisions that put your business at risk?" Victor's expression was answer enough. Over the next hour, we laid out everything. Derek's unauthorized leveraging of company assets, the failed development project he'd hidden from investors, and the web of financial maneuvers, designed to cover his tracks. "The house sale was meant to plug the immediate holes," Marcus explained, showing Victor the documentation. "But even that wouldn't have been enough to address the structural problems in the company's finances." Victor removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I knew something was wrong, but not this scope." He looked at me directly. "What do you want from me, Elena?" "Just the truth," I replied. "When the time comes, I need you to confirm what Derek has done. Not just to me, but to the business you built together." As Victor left, promising to review the additional documents Marcus provided, Olivia turned to me with an expression that mixed concern with admiration. "Are you ready for what comes next?" she asked. "Once we pull this trigger, Derek will fight back with everything he has." I thought about the man who had promised partnership but delivered control, who had planned to discard me when my value diminished in his eyes, who had thought me too weak or too naive to protect myself. "I've been ready since the moment I saw those emails," I replied. "Let's proceed." That evening, as instructed by Olivia, I called Derek at Blue Mountain Resort. He answered on the 4th ring, ambient noise suggesting he was at dinner. "Elena, is everything okay?" His voice carried the slight annoyance of someone interrupted during leisure time. "Not exactly," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "There's been some confusion about the house. Someone from the county assessor's office called, about updating their records." I could almost hear him straightening in his chair. "What did they want?" "Something about ownership transfer documentation." I wasn't entirely clear, still a bit foggy from the medication. I paused deliberately. "I told them you'd call on Monday to sort it out." "Don't worry about it," he said quickly. "I'll handle it. You just focus on your recovery." "There was something else," I continued. "A certified letter arrived for you. Looks official." "Did you open it?" The edge in his voice was unmistakable now. "Of course not, but the return address is Chen and Wilson Legal Associates. Isn't that Olivia's firm? My old college roommate? I didn't know you had business with them." The silence that followed told me everything about Derek's mental calculations. "I'll be home tomorrow," he said finally. Don't do anything with that letter. Just leave everything as it is." After we hung up, I texted Olivia. "He took the bait, coming home tomorrow." Her response was immediate. "Perfect timing. Everything's in place." I slept soundly that night for the first time since my diagnosis. Whatever happened next, I had reclaimed something essential. Not just my legal right to our home, but my confidence in my own judgment and strength. Derek arrived the following afternoon, earlier than expected, his expression a carefully controlled mask of casual concern. "How are you feeling?" he asked, setting his overnight bag down in the foyer as if he'd just returned from a routine business trip. "Better each day," I replied honestly. "The doctor says I'm healing well." "Good, good." His eyes scanned the entry table where mail was typically placed. "You mentioned a letter?" I gestured toward his home office. "I put it on your desk. Seemed important." He moved quickly toward the office, abandoning any pretense of casual conversation. I followed slowly, giving him time to open the envelope and absorb its contents. When I reached the office doorway, Derek was standing behind his desk, the letter gripped tightly in his hand, his face pale with what might have been shock or fury. "What is this?" he demanded, holding up the document. "I believe it's a notice regarding the property status of Cedar Lane Estate," I replied calmly. "And a preliminary injunction against the sale you arranged." "This is ridiculous. The sale is already complete. The money has been transferred." I moved further into the room, more confident with each step. "That's the interesting part, actually. According to county records, you sold property that wasn't entirely yours to sell." Derek's laugh was sharp, dismissive. "The house is in my name, Elena. Has been for months. You can check the deed." I did check. So did Marcus Wilson, Olivia's colleague who specializes in property law. He found it fascinating how you removed my name without proper notification, especially considering my inheritance investment in the property. Derek's expression flickered, the first hint of uncertainty crossing his features. That money was a gift to our marriage. The renovations were my project. "That's not how the financial records show it," I said, moving to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "My inheritance was specifically designated for property improvement, with documented intent to establish equity. Marcus calls it a constructive trust interest. Very technical, very legal, and very valid." Derek stared at me, really seeing me perhaps for the first time in years. "You planned this." "No, Derek, you planned this." I corrected him gently. "I simply protected myself." He shook his head, confidence returning. "It doesn't matter. The sale has already gone through. The money that's already been partially transferred to accounts under Amber's name," I finished for him. "The same accounts you've been using to hide assets from your business partner, Victor." At the mention of Victor's name, Derek sank slowly into his chair. "You've been talking to Victor, and he's been very interested in learning about your creative accounting, particularly that environmental contamination situation you've been hiding from investors." Derek's face hardened. "You're bluffing. Victor would never—" "People often surprise you when you give them reason to look closely at their own interests," I said. "Just as I surprised you by not being as naive as you assumed." For a moment, Derek seemed at a loss for words, an unfamiliar state for a man who had built his career on persuasive confidence. Then his expression shifted, calculation replacing shock. "What do you want, Elena? Money? A better settlement? Just tell me, and we can work something out between us, without lawyers." The question struck me as so fundamentally misguided that I almost laughed. After everything, the deception, the betrayal, the casual cruelty, he still believed this was a negotiation, a business transaction where terms could be adjusted to reach an acceptable compromise. "I want what you promised 15 years ago," I said simply. "A partnership of equals. But since that's clearly not possible, I'll settle for justice instead." I stood carefully, my surgical incision still tender but healing, much like the wound of his betrayal. "You'll find all the relevant documentation with your attorney. I suggest you read it thoroughly before our court date next week." Derek moved quickly around the desk, his voice dropping to the persuasive tone he used for difficult clients. "Elena, be reasonable. We can solve this privately, for both our sakes." "I am being reasonable," I replied, moving toward the door. "In fact, I'm being generous. I could have pressed charges for fraud given what you attempted while I was in surgery. Instead, I'm simply reclaiming what's legally mine and ensuring Victor knows the true state of the business. Where are you going? He demanded as I continued, toward the foyer. To my sister's for the weekend, I answered. I need space to recover, from the surgery and from this conversation. I suggest you use the time to consider your options carefully. As I reached for the front door, Derek called out one last attempt. You can't do this to me. After everything I've given you, everything I've built. I turned back, meeting his gaze directly. That's where you're wrong, Derek. You didn't build everything. We did. And the parts I built, I'm keeping. The weekend at Sophie's apartment gave me the physical and emotional space I needed to prepare for what would follow. She asked few questions, offering silent support as I alternated between moments of fierce resolve and quiet grief for the marriage I had believed in. He's been calling non-stop, she mentioned Sunday evening, checking her phone. Should I tell him you're staying longer? I shook my head. No, I'm going home tomorrow. It's time to establish the new normal. When I returned to Cedar Lane Estate Monday morning, Derek's car was gone, along with most of his clothes and personal items. A note on the kitchen counter informed me he would be staying with a friend until this misunderstanding is resolved. The misunderstanding was addressed formally 3 days later in a preliminary court hearing where Judge Sandra Myers reviewed the documentation provided by Marcus and Olivia. The court finds sufficient evidence to maintain the injunction against the property sale of Cedar Lane Estate, she declared after nearly 2 hours of legal arguments. Furthermore, all proceeds from the attempted sale are to remain in escrow, pending full resolution of ownership claims. Derek's attorney immediately requested a continuance to prepare additional arguments, which the judge granted with obvious reluctance. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a strange lightness despite the knowledge that the legal battle was far from over. Olivia squeezed my arm supportively as we descended the steps. Round one to us, she said with quiet satisfaction. Their faces when Marcus presented the inheritance documentation? Priceless. What happens next? I asked as we reached her car. They'll fight, of course. Derek has too much at stake to concede easily. She unlocked the doors with a beep. But we have the stronger position legally, and with Victor's testimony about the business irregularities, Derek has serious vulnerabilities he'll want to avoid exposing further. The full legal proceeding stretched over 4 months, a period during which I returned to hospital administration, reconnected with friends Derek had gradually isolated me from, and slowly reclaimed spaces within Cedar Lane Estate that had become foreign to me during our marriage. I repainted the dining room a color Derek had vetoed years earlier. I converted his trophy room into a home office for myself. Small acts of reclamation that helped me visualize a future beyond the shadow of his influence. The final settlement, when it eventually came, reflected the strength of our legal position. Cedar Lane Estate was recognized as partly mine through constructive trust doctrine based on my inheritance investment. Derek, facing mounting legal pressures, and Victor's decision to cooperate with financial regulators, agreed to transfer full ownership to me in exchange for my silence regarding certain business practices that could have led to criminal charges. Amber, discovering that the accounts in her name contained funds that might be subject to clawback, ended their relationship with remarkable speed. On the 1-year anniversary of my surgery, I hosted a small gathering at Cedar Lane Estate, not to celebrate the victory over Derek, but to mark my personal recovery and the reclamation of my independence. Sophie was there, along with Olivia, Marcus, and friends who had re-entered my life as Derek's influence faded. Grace Thompson, my former mentor who had warned me about Derek years earlier, warnings I had regrettably dismissed, raised her glass in a toast to new beginnings and hard-won wisdom. As the evening progressed, Olivia joined me on the back terrace, both of us watching fireflies illuminate the garden that had once been my only domain in a house controlled by my husband. Any regrets? She asked, swirling her wine thoughtfully. I considered the question carefully. About ending the marriage? No. About not seeing the truth sooner? Sometimes. You saw it when it mattered most, she observed. Many people never do. Later, after the guests had departed, I walked through the quiet rooms of Cedar Lane Estate, no longer the Rodriguez family legacy, but my own. The eastern wing with its renovated kitchen and master suite, funded by my inheritance. The garden I had designed and nurtured. The spaces that had once felt like a beautiful prison, but now represented freedom. In the home office that had once been Derek's inner sanctum, I reviewed hospital administration reports for an upcoming board meeting. My return to Riverside Memorial had been welcomed by colleagues who remembered my competence and vision. Within 6 months, I had been promoted to full administrator, the position I had abandoned years earlier at Derek's urging. My phone chimed, with a text from Sophie. Still coming to Columbus next weekend? The kids are counting the days until Aunt Elena visits. I smiled, confirming the plans we'd made. Another small reclamation, the family connections Derek had subtly discouraged. Over the years, as I prepared for bed, I paused at the window overlooking the driveway where, 1 year earlier, I had watched my husband load his golf clubs into another woman's car, believing he had orchestrated my complete defeat. He couldn't have known then that his actions while I was in surgery would ultimately lead not to my downfall, but to my liberation. The house stood solid around me, its century-old foundations outlasting the man who had thought it was his to discard. In the quiet darkness, I made a silent promise to myself. Never again would I mistake control for partnership or security for love. The home I had fought to keep would now shelter a woman who had finally, thoroughly, found her own strength. If you found strength in witnessing this journey from betrayal to empowerment, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story reveals how a simple email mistake led to an even more unexpected reclamation of power. The morning after I confronted Derek with the legal notice, I found myself alone in our Tudor home for the first time in weeks. Rain tapped gently against the stained glass accents in our foyer, windows I'd personally selected during the renovation 3 years ago. The same renovation funded entirely by my father's inheritance, a fact Derek had conveniently forgotten when removing my name from the deed. I made my way carefully to the kitchen, my body still tender from surgery, but my mind unexpectedly clear. There was something clarifying about finally seeing the truth of my marriage, as if a fog had lifted from not just my thinking, but my very perception of the world around me. I prepared a single cup of coffee and carried it to the garden nook, the small breakfast alcove that overlooked the rose beds I'd painstakingly cultivated each spring. Derek had always dismissed my gardening as a cute hobby, suggesting I hire a landscaper like normal people of our standing. I'd refused, finding peace in the simple act of nurturing something beautiful with my own hands. Now, I recognized that these roses represented perhaps the only thing in our shared life that had truly been mine alone. My phone vibrated on the table. Olivia. How are you holding up? Her voice carried the professional confidence that had always intimidated Derek, one of many reasons he'd subtly discouraged our friendship over the years. Better than expected, I replied, watching a cardinal land on the bird feeder outside the window. He cleared out most of his clothes last night, left a note saying he's staying with a friend until this misunderstanding is resolved. Olivia's laugh was short and without humor. A friend named Amber, no doubt, and I'd hardly call fraud a misunderstanding. His attorney called this morning, I continued, suggested an informal discussion before things escalate unnecessarily. Classic. Intimidation tactic. They want to feel you out, see if you'll settle quickly and quietly. Her voice took on the sharp edge I remembered from our college days when someone had wronged a friend. You're not going, I hope. Actually, I thought I might. I sipped my coffee, allowing the idea that had been forming since dawn to crystallize. On my terms, of course. Silence from Olivia's end, then a measured response. Elena, meeting with them alone is not alone, I clarified. I thought perhaps lunch at Bellamy's. You, me, Derek, and his attorney. Neutral ground, public setting. Bellamy's? The question, in her voice, was clear. Bellamy's wasn't just any restaurant. It was where the city's power brokers conducted their most important business. Where deals were made and broken over $200 bottles of wine. Derek took me there for our anniversary last year, I explained. Made quite a show of knowing the owner personally, having the best table reserved perpetually in his name. I think it's time I visited his favorite establishment, with his legal opposition in tow. The plan took shape quickly after that. Olivia would arrange the meeting through formal channels, presenting it as a gesture of good faith. Marcus would prepare a concise brief outlining our strongest legal points, not as a negotiation starter, but as a demonstration of our position's strength. I would do what I had always done best: observe, listen, and identify the leverage points others missed. 3 days later, at precisely 1 p.m., Olivia and I entered Bellamy's polished interior. The restaurant hummed with the muted conversations of Riverside Heights elite, bankers, developers, and politicians conducting their affairs over expertly prepared meals and strategic glasses of wine. I had selected my outfit with deliberate care. A tailored burgundy dress that conveyed both professional confidence and feminine strength, paired with modest but elegant jewelry. Nothing flashy, nothing desperate, the antithesis of what Derek would expect from his emotionally fragile wife. The maitre d' recognized me immediately, his professional smile flickering with momentary confusion. "Mrs. Rodriguez, always a pleasure. Mr. Rodriguez hasn't arrived yet, but your table is ready." I corrected him gently but firmly. "Ms. Vasquez, actually, I've returned to my professional name." A small declaration of independence that felt surprisingly significant as the words left my mouth. We were led to Derek's regular table, a corner location with excellent privacy and sightlines, to both the entrance and the rest of the dining room. A strategic choice, typically reserved for those the restaurant considered VIPs. I selected the seat that would force Derek to face the room rather than command it, a subtle power shift he would immediately notice. Olivia arranged her legal pad and pen with precise movements. "Remember, the goal today isn't resolution, it's assessment. We want to gauge how far he's willing to go, what he values most, and what he fears losing." I nodded, scanning the room, reflexively. The habit had developed during my hospital administration days, always knowing who was present, who was watching, who might be approached if a situation required intervention. My gaze halted abruptly on a familiar figure seated across the restaurant. Victor Patel, Derek's business partner, deep in conversation with an older man I recognized as Franklin Walsh, one of the city's most prominent commercial real estate investors. Interesting timing. Before I could mention this to Olivia, the restaurant's atmosphere subtly shifted. Derek had arrived. He navigated between tables with practiced charm, nodding to acquaintances, his attorney James Barrett following. Closely behind. Derek had chosen Barrett carefully, one of the city's most aggressive divorce attorneys, known for representing high-net-worth men seeking to protect assets from gold-digging spouses. "Elena," Derek greeted as he reached our table, his voice carrying just the right notes of concerned affection. For anyone observing, he would appear the picture of a husband facing an unfortunate misunderstanding. "You're looking well. The surgery recovery seems to be progressing nicely." I offered a measured smile. Amazing what proper rest and clarity of purpose can do for healing. Barrett extended his hand to Olivia with professional courtesy, then to me with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I hope we can approach this discussion with an eye toward amicable resolution." "Ms. Vasquez," I corrected again, accepting his handshake with firm pressure. "And I certainly hope for resolution, though I believe amicable might depend entirely on your client's willingness to acknowledge reality." The subtle stiffening of Derek's posture confirmed that my directness had caught him off guard. He'd expected the version of me that had emerged from surgery, vulnerable, medication-fogged and easily managed. Instead, he was facing the woman I'd been before our marriage had slowly eroded my independence, clear-eyed, articulate, and unwilling to be underestimated. As they took their seats, I noted Derek's quick scan of the restaurant, his automatic assessment of who might be watching, who might report back to business associates about this unusual lunch meeting. His gaze snagged briefly on Victor's table, genuine surprise registering before he smoothly masked it. "Shall we order first?" he suggested, reaching for the wine list with the confident gesture of a man accustomed to controlling even the smallest details of social interactions. I placed my hand on the leather-bound list before he could open it. "I've already arranged for a bottle of the Châteauneuf du Pape you enjoyed so much at our anniversary dinner. I hope that's acceptable." The sommelier appeared almost immediately. Presenting the bottle Derek himself had introduced me to years ago, explaining its rarity and significance with the condescending patience of someone educating a novice. Now I was the one who had ordered it in advance, who nodded approval at the label, who accepted the ritual taste with knowledgeable appreciation. Another small reclamation. Lunch proceeded with outward civility masking the strategic maneuvers. Beneath, Barrett outlined what he called a generous proposal for settling our differences without unnecessary litigation. The terms were, as Olivia had predicted, insultingly one-sided. I would relinquish all claims to Cedar Lane Estate, accept a reasonable stipend for 6 months to establish independent living arrangements, and sign a confidentiality agreement regarding Derek's business practices. In exchange, Derek would not pursue claims that I had interfered with legitimate business transactions or misrepresented my health situation to manipulate financial outcomes. The sheer audacity of this counter-accusation, suggesting I had somehow orchestrated my tumor and surgery as part of a financial scheme, would have left me speechless in my previous life. Now I merely sipped my wine and allowed Olivia to respond with professional disdain. "Mr. Barrett, I assume your client has not fully briefed you on the documentation we've submitted to the court," she said, sliding a thin folder across the table. "Perhaps you should review this before proceeding with allegations that border on defamation." As Barrett paged through the concise evidence Marcus had prepared, bank transfers documenting my inheritance investment in the property, medical records confirming my diagnosis and treatment timeline, property records showing Derek's unauthorized removal of my name from the deed, I focused my attention on Derek himself. His expression remained controlled, but I recognized the subtle indicators of his growing tension, the slight tightening around his eyes, the minute adjustment of his tie, the way his fingers kept returning to his water glass rather than his wine. Derek had always been confident in his ability to manage situations through personality and persuasion. Confronted with documented evidence and witnesses, however, his playbook failed him. "This is creative interpretation at best," Barrett finally declared, closing the folder with deliberate casualness. The inheritance funds were clearly a gift to the marriage. The property transfer was standard estate planning given Ms. Vasquez's health concerns, and the business matters are entirely separate issues that have no bearing on the divorce proceedings. Those business matters involve using matrimonial assets to cover financial losses, Olivia countered smoothly, which makes them directly relevant to equitable distribution. And I believe your client's business partner might have significant input regarding those transactions. Derek's eyes darted to Victor's table, a tell so obvious that even Barrett noticed. The attorney leaned closer to Derek, their whispered exchange just audible enough for me to catch fragments. "Didn't mention conflict of interest. Reconsider our approach." I chose that moment to address Derek directly for the first time since the preliminary pleasantries. "I spent 10 years believing we were building something together," I said, my voice quiet but steady. 10 years watching you gradually erase my contributions while benefiting from them. When you discovered I needed surgery, your first thought wasn't concern for my health. It was opportunity for your freedom." Derek started to interrupt with practiced indignation. but I continued, without pausing. I don't want to destroy what you've built, Derek. I simply want recognition of what I contributed, what legally belongs to me, and the dignity of truth rather than manipulation. Elena, you're twisting what happened, Derek began, his expression shifting to the concerned, patient look he'd perfected for managing what he perceived as my emotional overreactions. The facts aren't twistable, I replied simply. The documentation exists. The witnesses exist. Your actions while I was literally unconscious on an operating table exist. The only variable now is how much additional damage you're willing to sustain by fighting reality. The arrival of our entrees provided a momentary reprieve from the tension. As the waiter arranged our plates with practiced efficiency, I noticed Victor rising from his table across the restaurant. Instead of heading toward the exit, however, he began making his way directly toward us. Derek noticed too late to intercept. By the time he half rose from his chair, Victor had already reached our table, his expression a careful mask of professional neutrality. Elena, good to see you recovering well, Victor said with genuine warmth. Derek, we need to discuss the Westfield portfolio before your meeting with the investors tomorrow. The environmental report came back with some concerning findings. The color drained from Derek's face so rapidly, I momentarily worried about his health. The Westfield development was the troubled project at the center of his financial manipulations. The reason he'd needed to sell our house so urgently. If the environmental issues were now documented officially, the entire investment structure was at risk of collapse. This isn't the time, Victor, Derek managed, his voice tight. It's exactly the time, Victor replied evenly, especially since the report arrived with a notice that the EPA has taken interest in the site history. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. Without waiting for response, Victor nodded politely to Olivia and me, then moved toward the restaurant's entrance, clearly expecting Derek to follow. The choice now facing my husband was exquisitely uncomfortable. Remain at the negotiation lunch and risk Victor discussing the Westfield situation with other partners, or abandon the lunch to manage this new crisis. Derek stood abruptly, his napkin falling unnoticed to the floor. We need to continue this discussion later. Barrett will coordinate with Ms. Chen. Without further ceremony, he followed Victor, leaving his attorney looking distinctly uncomfortable at being abandoned mid-negotiation. Barrett gathered his materials with practiced dignity. We'll prepare a revised proposal, he offered, rising from his chair. Perhaps with more realistic expectations now that emotions have had time to settle. Olivia's smile was pleasant but unyielding. We look forward to reviewing it, Counselor. Though I suggest consulting with a property law specialist before drafting. These situations have rather specific precedents that general family law practice might not fully encompass. After Barrett's departure, Olivia and I remained at the table, completing our meal with the unhurried confidence of people who had achieved exactly what they'd intended. That went even better than expected, Olivia observed, accepting a dessert menu from the hovering waiter. Victor's timing was impeccable, almost as if someone had mentioned our lunch plans to him. I finished, allowing myself a small smile. Grace Thompson serves on the hospital board with Victor's wife. Information travels in interesting circles in Riverside Heights. Olivia laughed softly. You've changed, Elena. The woman I knew in college was brilliant but cautious. You're playing three-dimensional chess now. I considered this assessment as I sipped the last of my wine. Not changed, I finally decided. Returned. This is who I was before Derek convinced me that his way was the only way, that his vision was inherently superior to mine, that his confidence was somehow more valid than my competence. The journey back to this version of myself hadn't begun with discovering Derek's betrayal. It had started much earlier, with small moments of clarity breaking through the careful construction of our marriage. The time I'd corrected his misrepresentation of hospital policy at a charity event. Only to have him laugh it off as my wife always concerned with the little details. The board meeting where he'd presented my operational strategy for a development project as his own inspiration. The night he'd belittled my concern about investing my inheritance in property renovations rather than maintaining independent savings. These moments had registered as small discomforts at the time, easily rationalized and forgotten. Now I recognized them as warning signs I had chosen to ignore, believing that partnership sometimes required compromise. What I hadn't understood was the difference between compromise and subjugation, between building together and being absorbed. 3 days after our Bellamy's lunch, the legal landscape shifted dramatically. Barrett requested an emergency meeting, with Olivia and Marcus, arriving at their office with uncharacteristic humility and a substantially revised settlement proposal. "The EPA investigation has complicated matters for my client," he explained with practiced understatement. "He's interested in resolving the matrimonial issues expediently to focus on these business concerns." The new terms acknowledged my inheritance, investment in Cedar Lane Estate, offering a 50-50 ownership split with a structured buyout that would transfer full ownership to me over 3 years. Derek would retain most of his business assets, but I would receive a percentage of specific completed projects I had directly contributed to during my time with the company. "This is movement in the right direction," Marcus acknowledged, reviewing the document carefully. "But the property transfer issue remains problematic. Your client removed Ms. Vasquez's name fraudulently, then attempted to sell the property without her knowledge while she was literally incapacitated. An unfortunate timing coincidence," Barrett attempted weakly. "A criminal act," Olivia corrected, flatly. "One that would interest the district attorney if we chose to pursue that avenue." The mention of potential criminal charges shifted the atmosphere in the room. Barrett straightened in his chair, abandoning pretense. "What does your client actually want? Just tell me her number." I had anticipated this moment, the point where Derek, through his representative, would attempt to reduce my life and my justice to a monetary figure. The point where he believed everything and everyone had a price at which principle gave way to pragmatism. "I want Cedar Lane Estate transferred to my name entirely," I stated clearly. "I want formal documentation acknowledging my contributions to the Rodriguez Development Group projects I worked on. I want my medical expenses covered in full, and I want Derek's written acknowledgement of what he attempted to do." Barrett scoffed at the last item. "My client won't admit to criminal intent in writing. That's a non-starter." "Not criminal intent," I clarified. "Just the factual timeline. That he removed my name from the property without my knowledge or consent. That he arranged the sale while I was in surgery. Simple facts without characterization. And if we provide these items, then I sign a confidentiality agreement regarding Derek's business practices and the EPA situation with Westfield," I stated. "I make no claims against Rodriguez Development assets beyond what I've outlined, and Derek avoids both criminal exposure and the public embarrassment of the detailed court proceedings that would otherwise follow." The calculus was clear on Barrett's face as he weighed the options. Derek had sent him with authority to negotiate a financial settlement, expecting that, like most divorce cases, this would ultimately come down to a number. Instead, he was facing requests that went beyond money to accountability and recognition. "I'll present your terms to my client," he finally said, gathering his papers. "But I should warn you that Derek is not accustomed to acknowledging mistakes." I smiled without humor. "Yes, I learned that firsthand over 10 years of marriage. Perhaps it's time he developed some new customs." As Olivia showed Barrett out, Marcus turned to me with thoughtful assessment. "You've leveraged this perfectly," he observed. "The EPA investigation has Derek cornered financially, and Victor's cooperation gives us visibility into the business issues that would otherwise remain opaque. But I'm curious about your focus on the written acknowledgement. Most clients in your position would push for a larger financial settlement." I considered how to explain what had become increasingly clear to me during my recovery, both physical and emotional. This was never about money, Marcus. It was about truth. For years, I allowed Derek to construct a narrative where his perspective was reality, where his decisions were automatically correct, where his assessment of my value defined my actual worth. I gestured to the settlement documents on the table. The financial terms are fair. I don't want more than I contributed or deserve. But without acknowledgement of what actually happened, Derek would simply construct a new narrative, one where I was emotional, or opportunistic, or vindictive. The written record prevents that revisionist history. Marcus nodded slowly. Controlling the narrative rather than just the outcome. Strategic. Necessary, I corrected gently, for me to truly move forward. The final settlement negotiations stretched over 2 more weeks, with Derek resisting the acknowledgement requirement with particular vehemence. In the end, however, his deteriorating business position left him with diminishing options. The Westfield development was now under formal EPA investigation, with preliminary findings suggesting that Rodriguez Development might have been aware of contamination issues before purchase, a disclosure violation with potential criminal implications. Victor had provided evidence that Derek had concealed these issues from both investors and partners, using funds from other projects, including proceeds from the attempted sale of our home, to cover mounting remediation costs. With legal pressure mounting on multiple fronts, Derek finally capitulated to my settlement terms, though not without a final attempt at manipulation. "He wants to meet with you personally," Olivia reported after Barrett's call. "Alone. Before signing. Says there are things that should be said directly, not through lawyers." The old Elena might have agreed immediately, eager to reconcile, to smooth rough edges, to maintain peace even at personal cost. The woman I had reclaimed would make no such concession. "He can say whatever he needs to say with you present," I replied firmly. "I'm done with private conversations that conveniently lack witnesses." The signing meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon at Olivia's office. I arrived early, taking time to center myself for what would likely be an emotionally charged encounter. After years of marriage and weeks of legal maneuvering, this would mark the formal beginning of my independent life, a threshold both liberating and intimidating. Derek arrived precisely on time, impeccably dressed as always, though I noted the subtle signs of strain in his appearance. The confident ease that had once seemed his birthright now appeared more deliberately constructed, a performance requiring visible effort. "Elena," he greeted, his tone carefully calibrated between formality and intimacy. "You're looking well." "Thank you," I replied simply, neither encouraging nor rejecting the personal observation. Barrett and Olivia efficiently arranged the multiple documents requiring signatures, explaining key provisions with professional detachment. Throughout this process, I felt Derek's gaze returning to me repeatedly, searching for something. Weakness, perhaps, or regret, or the vulnerability he had grown accustomed to exploiting. When all that remained was his signature on the acknowledgement document, the simple factual statement of his actions regarding Cedar Lane Estate, Derek hesitated, pen hovering above the page. "This isn't necessary," he said, voice low. "You've won everything else. This serves no purpose except humiliation." "It serves the purpose of truth," I replied evenly. "Something our marriage lacked for far too long." His expression hardened. "I gave you everything, Elena. A lifestyle most women would be grateful for. Security, status, a beautiful home. You gave me the appearance of those things," I corrected gently, "while ensuring I remained dependent on your approval to maintain them. That's not partnership, Derek. It's ownership. And I was never yours to own." Something shifted in his eyes then, perhaps the first genuine recognition that the woman before him was not the one he had systematically diminished over years of subtle manipulation. This Elena would not be managed, placated, or controlled through familiar tactics. "If I sign this," he said, gesturing to the document, Will you at least tell me when it changed? When you started working against me? The question revealed how fundamentally Derek had misunderstood what had transpired between us. Even now, he framed my self-protection as aggression, my autonomy as betrayal. I never worked against you, Derek. I simply stopped working solely for you. There's a difference. I met his gaze directly. And it changed the moment I found evidence you were planning to sell our home while I was in surgery. That wasn't a business decision or a marital disagreement. It was a profound moral choice that revealed who you truly are. Without further comment, Derek signed the acknowledgement, his signature uncharacteristically tight compared to his usual expansive flourish. As Barrett gathered the completed documents, Derek stood abruptly. I hope you understand what you're giving up, he said, straightening his jacket with a gesture I recognized as self-comfort rather than actual adjustment. Not just me, but the life we built, the connections, the standing in this community. I smiled, genuinely if sadly. I'm not giving up anything that was ever truly mine, Derek. And I'm reclaiming quite a bit that should have been. After they departed, Olivia handed me a copy of the fully executed settlement agreement, the pages still warm from the copier. Congratulations, she said, her professional demeanor softening. Not many people manage to extract both justice and dignity from these situations. I accepted the document, feeling its weight, physical and symbolic, in my hands. It doesn't feel like victory, I admitted. Just resolution. That's because it's not the end of something, Olivia observed wisely. It's the beginning. The question now is, what will Elena Vasquez build on this foundation? It was the right question, perhaps the only one that truly mattered now. For so long, my identity had been defined in relation to Derek, his wife, his business associate, his social partner. Even during the legal proceedings, I had been his adversary, his problem to solve. Now, with those definitions falling away, I faced the exhilarating and terrifying freedom of self-determination. That evening, I walked slowly through Cedar Lane Estate, my estate now, legally and completely. I traced my fingers along walls that had witnessed both my gradual diminishment and my eventual reclamation. In the study that had once been Derek's exclusive domain, I removed the pretentious oil portrait of his grandfather that had always dominated the space. In its place, I hung a simple photograph of my father, the man whose inheritance had partially secured my independence through this ordeal. You were right, Dad, I whispered to the image of the man who had raised me to value self-reliance above security. Some gifts come with invisible strings attached, but some investments pay dividends you never anticipated. Outside the study window, dusk settled over the garden I had cultivated while my marriage withered. The roses were entering their second bloom of the season, a reminder that renewal often follows periods of apparent dormancy. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, new directions, new definitions of success and fulfillment. For tonight, it was enough to stand firmly on ground I had fought to claim as my own. Not as someone's wife or someone's opponent, but simply as myself, Elena Vasquez, reclaiming the path I had temporarily abandoned but never completely forgotten. With the legal battle behind me, I faced the challenge of rebuilding a life that was truly my own. For so long, my identity had been intertwined with Derek's, his wife, his business partner, his social accessory. Now, standing in my kitchen on a crisp autumn morning 6 weeks after the settlement, I realized I needed to rediscover who Elena Vasquez was when not defined by those relationships. The first step had been surprisingly practical, changing my name back legally on all documentation. Bank accounts, credit cards, medical records, professional certifications. Each form I signed felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been submerged beneath the Rodriguez identity. My sister Sophie had laughed when I described the satisfaction of receiving my new driver's license. Most people only get excited about the photo not being terrible, she'd said. Leave it to you to find emotional healing in government paperwork. But the process of reclaiming my name had indeed been healing, a tangible demonstration that identity could be chosen rather than assigned. Now, as I sipped my morning coffee in the garden nook, a space I'd begun to redecorate in colors Derek had always dismissed as impractical, I reviewed the list I'd created during my early morning reflection. Elena Vasquez. Next chapter. The heading itself had taken courage to write. For years, I'd subordinated my personal ambitions to Derek's vision of our shared future. The idea of charting my own course, answerable only to my own values and priorities, was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. My phone chimed with a calendar alert. Interview, Riverside Memorial, 10:30 a.m. My stomach tightened with a familiar anxiety. Despite my confidence in the legal arena, professional reinvention felt more vulnerable somehow. I had reached out to my former hospital network 3 weeks ago, unsure if bridges had been burned when I'd left to join Derek's company. To my surprise, Grace Thompson, now Chief Operations Officer, had responded personally and enthusiastically. The Elena I knew was one of the most capable administrators I've ever worked with, she'd said during our preliminary coffee meeting. We've been trying to fill the Director of Strategic Planning position for months. If you're interested in returning to healthcare, I'd like you to meet with the executive team. As I dressed for the interview, I deliberately avoided the conservative suits and muted colors that had defined my Derek's wife wardrobe. Instead, I chose a vibrant blue dress that Sophie had convinced me to buy during a recent shopping trip. You used to wear colors before him, she'd noted, holding up the dress. I remember. I did too, suddenly. The turquoise blouse I'd worn when first meeting Derek, the emerald sweater he'd complimented then subtly suggested was a bit loud for the country club dinner. How gradually those preferences had been reshaped. Those small expressions of personality, gently but persistently pruned away. The hospital complex looked both familiar and foreign as I pulled into the visitor parking lot. I'd walked these grounds daily for years before leaving, yet now I noticed details that had previously escaped my attention. The carefully tended flower beds near the entrance, the new pediatric wing with its colorful animal murals, the coffee cart operated by a local roastery rather than a national chain. At reception, I was surprised when the elderly volunteer looked up and immediately smiled in recognition. Ms. Vasquez, welcome back. Mr. Johnson had been volunteering at Riverside Memorial for over 20 years, a fixture at the front desk every Tuesday and Thursday. The fact that he remembered me and used my maiden name without prompting touched me unexpectedly. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. It's good to be back. They've been talking about your interview all week, he confided, handing me a visitor badge. Between you and me, I think Grace has already cleared out that office for you. The executive suite had been renovated since my departure, the formerly sterile hallway now featuring artwork from local artists and comfortable seating areas. Grace met me personally, emerging from her office with the brisk efficiency I remembered, tempered now with a warmth that seemed new. Right on time as always, she said, clasping my hand firmly. Some things never change, thank goodness. The interview itself was more conversational than evaluative, with the executive team clearly having already discussed my potential return. Questions focused less on qualifications, which they knew intimately from my previous tenure, and more on vision. What did I see as the hospital's greatest opportunities? How might we better serve our increasingly diverse community? What innovations from other healthcare systems could benefit our patients? Speaking about these topics, I felt a familiar energy return, the intellectual engagement and purpose that hospital administration had always provided. This wasn't about status or appearances. It was about solving complex problems that directly impacted people's lives at their most vulnerable moments. One last question, Dr. Patel, the new chief medical officer, said toward the end of our discussion. You've been away from healthcare for several years. What brings you back now? It was the question I'd prepared for most carefully, aware that my answer needed to bridge my past and future without dwelling inappropriately on personal matters. I took a measured breath before responding. Healthcare has always been my professional home, I began. My time away gave me valuable perspective on operations management and property development that I believe will enhance my contributions here. But fundamentally, I've returned because this work aligns with my core values in a way nothing else has. At Riverside Memorial, success is measured by patient outcomes and community health, not quarterly profits or stakeholder returns. That purpose-driven mission is something I've missed profoundly. Dr. Patel nodded thoughtfully, exchanging glances with Grace. Something unspoken passed between them. Approval, perhaps, or confirmation of a decision already made. "We'd like to offer you the position," Grace said, turning back to me. "With one adjustment to the original posting. Given your previous experience and the specific needs we're facing, we'd like to create a new role. Vice President of Strategic Integration. The focus would be on aligning our clinical excellence with operational efficiency and community engagement." The title and responsibilities represented a significant promotion from my previous position, and a level of authority I had never been granted at Rodriguez Development despite years of proven capability. The salary Grace proposed was substantially higher than I had anticipated, reflecting both my experience and the expanded scope of the role. "I'd like some time to consider the details," I said, maintaining professional composure despite the excitement building within me. "But I'm very interested in the opportunity." Grace smiled, standing to signal the interview's conclusion. "Take the weekend to review the formal offer letter. We're hoping you can start within the month. We have some significant initiatives that would benefit from your immediate input." As I drove home from the hospital, I was struck by the contrast between this professional interaction and those I'd grown accustomed to in Derek's world. There had been no subtle undermining of my competence, no veiled suggestions that I should be grateful for the opportunity, no implications that my value was primarily decorative rather than substantive. Instead, I had been evaluated on my merits and offered compensation commensurate with my contributions. The simplicity of this basic professional respect brought tears to my eyes as I pulled into the driveway of Cedar Lane Estate. Tears not of sadness, but of recognition. This was how it should have been all along. This was the partnership of equals Derek had promised, but never delivered. Inside, I placed the offer letter on the kitchen island and stared at it for several long moments. Taking this position would represent more than just a career move. It would be a definitive statement that Elena Vasquez was moving forward rather than looking back. My contemplation was interrupted by the doorbell, a rare occurrence since the settlement. Few people visited Cedar Lane Estate these days. The social circle that had once revolved around the Rodriguez name, having quickly recalibrated when Derek departed. I approached the front door cautiously, checking the security camera feed on my phone before opening it. Amber Collins stood on my doorstep, looking markedly different from the polished, confident woman who had driven away with Derek and his golf clubs months earlier. Her designer clothes had been replaced by jeans and a simple sweater, her perfectly styled hair now pulled back in a practical ponytail. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced," she said immediately, her voice lacking the smooth assurance I remembered. "I can leave if you don't want to talk to me." Curiosity overcame my initial instinct to dismiss her. "What do you want, Amber?" She shifted uncomfortably. "5 minutes of your time, that's all." I considered her request, trying to identify any potential harm in granting it. Finding none beyond momentary discomfort, I stepped back and gestured for her to enter. 5 minutes. We moved to the living room, where I deliberately took Derek's former chair, the oversized leather throne from which he had presided over countless social gatherings. Amber perched awkwardly on the edge of the sofa, looking both younger and more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. I came to apologize, she said after a moment of uncomfortable silence, and to return something. That belongs to you. From her purse, she withdrew a small velvet box that I recognized immediately. Inside was my grandmother's sapphire ring, a family heirloom I had discovered missing shortly after Derek moved out. I had assumed he had taken it as a final petty act of financial revenge. He gave this to me the weekend after your surgery, Amber explained, placing the box on the coffee table between us. Told me it was just costume jewelry his ex-wife had left behind. I found the appraisal paper when I was... She hesitated, leaving his apartment last week. I made no move to take the ring, studying Amber's expression instead. Why are you really here? Her carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. Because I was wrong. About everything. About him. She looked around the room, her gaze settling on the space where Derek's family photos had once dominated the mantel, now replaced by my own family mementos. He told me you were emotionally unstable, that you manipulated him financially, that the house was his family legacy you were trying to steal. And you believed him, I stated without inflection. I wanted to, she admitted, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. It made what we were doing seem justified, necessary, even. Rescuing him from a toxic situation rather than... Her voice trailed off. Rather than participating in the systematic gaslighting and financial exploitation of someone who was literally on an operating table, I finished for her, unable to completely suppress the edge in my voice. Amber flinched but didn't look away. Yes. Her direct acknowledgement surprised me. I had expected excuses, justifications, perhaps even accusations. The straightforward admission of wrongdoing seemed almost disorienting after years of Derek's elaborate emotional manipulations. What changed? I asked after a moment. He did. Or rather, he didn't. She smiled without humor. The patterns you lived with for years? They emerged with me in weeks. The separate finances became controlling behavior. The charming public persona gave way to private criticism. The temporary use of my credit became financial entanglement. I felt an unexpected twinge of empathy beneath my initial satisfaction. The woman before me had been both accomplice and victim, drawn in by the same charismatic manipulation that had once captivated me, only to discover the reality much more quickly. The EPA investigation was the breaking point, Amber continued. When he suggested I should take legal responsibility for some of the documentation failures since I had processed the paperwork, that's when I finally saw clearly what kind of man he actually is. So you left? She nodded. I resigned from Rodriguez Development yesterday. Victor has offered to provide references explaining the circumstances. The mention of Victor sparked my curiosity. How is the business faring? Not well, Amber admitted. The Westfield contamination issues are worse than initially reported. Several investors have filed suit, and without you managing operations... She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the implicit compliment. Without me managing operations, I prompted. The organizational infrastructure is collapsing. Projects are running behind schedule. Vendors aren't being paid promptly. The systems you built were apparently holding everything together, and Derek doesn't know how to maintain them. There was a certain poetic justice in this revelation, the behind-the-scenes contributions Derek had minimized and dismissed now proving essential in my absence. Yet I felt no real pleasure in the company's struggles. Too many innocent people, employees, contractors, community partners, would be affected by its decline. I should go, Amber said, rising from the sofa. I've taken more than my 5 minutes. I stood as well, retrieving my grandmother's ring from the table. Thank you for returning this. It has significant sentimental value. Amber nodded awkwardly, moving toward the door. As she reached for the handle, I found myself asking a question I hadn't planned. What will you do now? She paused, something like determination crossing her features. Start over. Somewhere new. Somewhere I can build something that's actually mine. Her eyes met mine with unexpected directness. Not unlike what you're doing, I imagine. After she left, I returned to the kitchen and placed my grandmother's ring beside the hospital offer letter, two symbols of reclamation and renewal now juxtaposed on the granite countertop. The conversation with Amber had stirred complicated emotions, vindication, certainly, but also a strange sense of closure. Seeing her journey out of Derek's influence mirrored aspects of my own, compressed into a much shorter time frame, but following similar patterns of revelation and resolution. I signed the acceptance letter that evening, officially committing to my return to healthcare leadership. As I sealed the envelope, my phone chimed with a text from Sophie. Decision made? Celebration dinner tomorrow? Yes and yes, I replied, feeling a lightness I hadn't experienced in months. New chapter officially beginning. Sophie responded immediately with champagne emojis, followed by, "So proud of you. Dad would be too." The mention of our father brought both warmth and a twinge of sadness. He had never fully trusted Derek, maintaining a polite but reserved relationship with my husband throughout our marriage. "Just make sure you keep something that's entirely yours," he had advised shortly before his passing. "Something he can't touch or change." At the time, I had dismissed his concern as overprotection. Now I recognized it as the wisdom of someone who had seen what I could not or would not see, the subtle erosion of my independence happening beneath the veneer of partnership. The following Monday marked my first official day as Vice President of Strategic Integration at Riverside Memorial. Walking through the hospital's main entrance as an employee rather than a visitor, I felt both the weight of responsibility and the thrill of purpose. This position represented not just professional advancement, but personal reclamation. A return to the career path I had abandoned when persuaded that Derek's vision should take precedence over my own. Grace met me at the executive suite, presenting me with an employee badge that featured my full professional title beneath my name, Elena Vasquez, MPH, VP Strategic Integration. "Welcome home," she said simply, handing me the badge with evident satisfaction. My new office was larger than the one I'd occupied in my previous tenure, with windows overlooking the healing garden I had helped design years earlier. On the desk sat a small welcome basket containing hospital-branded items, local artisanal treats, and a handwritten note from the executive team. The thoughtfulness of the gesture, so different from the transactional relationships that had characterized Derek's business world, reminded me why healthcare administration had always resonated with my core values. The morning passed quickly with orientation meetings and introductions to key personnel. Many remembered me from before, others knew me only by reputation. All seemed genuinely pleased by my return, several commenting that certain processes had never worked quite right after my departure. By lunchtime, I felt simultaneously exhausted and energized, the particular combination that comes from meaningful engagement with complex challenges. When Grace suggested we eat in the hospital's recently renovated cafe, I welcomed the opportunity to observe the facility from an operational perspective while processing the morning's information. "So," Grace said as we settled at a table near the windows, "how does it feel to be back?" I considered the question carefully. "Like finding a favorite sweater you forgot you owned," I finally replied. "Familiar, but fresh." Grace laughed appreciatively. "That's exactly how I felt when I returned to nursing administration after my detour into pharmaceutical sales. Sometimes the path forward requires a step sideways first." Her characterization of career evolution, not as failure or backtracking but as a natural progression with necessary detours, offered a framework for understanding my own journey. Perhaps my years with Rodriguez Development hadn't been merely a mistake or a deviation from my true course. Perhaps they had provided experiences and perspectives that would ultimately enhance my effectiveness in healthcare leadership. The board is particularly interested in your input on the Eastern Expansion Project, Grace mentioned as our conversation turned to current priorities. Your experience with property development gives you unique insight that none of the rest of us possess. The Eastern expansion had been in preliminary planning stages when I left Riverside Memorial, a proposed addition that would significantly increase the hospital's capacity for outpatient services while creating a more welcoming campus entrance. According to Grace, the project had stalled repeatedly due to budget concerns and disagreements about architectural approaches. I'd like to review the current proposals, I said, already mentally cataloging the questions I would need to address. Sustainability considerations, community integration, operational flow, scalability for future needs. They're compiled in your onboarding folder, Grace replied with a knowing smile. I had a feeling you'd want to dive into that particular challenge immediately. As we finished lunch and prepared to return to the executive suite, Grace paused, her expression becoming more serious. There's something I should mention before your meeting with Dr. Rivera this afternoon. The Physician Engagement Committee has been challenging since Dr. Patel took over as CMO. There's been resistance to several operational changes, particularly from the surgical department. I nodded, understanding the perennial tension between administrative efficiencies and clinical autonomy. Any specific pain points I should be aware of? Resource allocation for the new surgical suites, Grace explained. And the head of cardiothoracic surgery is particularly vocal about scheduling protocols. The mention of cardiothoracic surgery triggered a memory. Derek's enthusiastic description of his golf partner, the best heart surgeon in the state, who had apparently offered investment advice regarding several Rodriguez development projects. I had met the man only once at a hospital fundraiser, a confident, somewhat arrogant specialist named Dr. Harrison James? I asked, recalling the name suddenly. Grace's eyebrows rose in surprise. Yes, actually. Do you know him? We've met, I replied neutrally. He was acquainted with Derek socially. Grace's expression suggested she understood the potential complication. Dr. James had been one of Derek's staunchest advocates in the community, often publicly praising his business acumen and visionary approach to development. Whether the surgeon knew about Derek's less ethical business practices was unclear, but he had certainly benefited from their friendship, receiving early investment opportunities in several profitable projects. I can handle that relationship professionally, I assured Grace, recognizing her unspoken concern. I never doubted it, she replied with evident sincerity. Just thought you should be prepared. The afternoon proceeded with departmental briefings and systems orientation. Each meeting reinforced my conviction that returning to healthcare had been the right decision, not because it was easy or comfortable, but because the challenges aligned with my values in ways that real estate development never had. At Riverside Memorial, success was measured in patient outcomes and community health indicators rather than profit margins and investor returns. At 4:30, my assistant, a remarkably efficient young man named Jason, who had already demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate my informational needs, knocked gently on my open door. Ms. Vasquez, Dr. James is requesting a meeting with you. He says it's regarding the surgical suite allocation in the Eastern expansion. The timing was notable, barely 8 hours into my first day, with no public announcement yet about my specific role in the expansion project. Someone had evidently informed the surgeon of my return and anticipated involvement. Please schedule him for tomorrow afternoon, I replied, maintaining professional composure despite the flutter of anxiety in my stomach. And Jason, I'd appreciate having the current surgical utilization data available for that meeting. After Jason departed, I sat quietly for a moment, acknowledging the complex emotions triggered by this impending interaction. Dr. James represented a direct connection to the world I had left behind, the social circles that had quickly closed, ranks around Derek after our separation, the country club acquaintances who had accepted his narrative without question. Facing him would be challenging, particularly if he arrived with preconceived notions about both my professional capabilities and personal circumstances. Yet avoiding the interaction would only reinforce whatever limitations he might already associate with me. The diminished version of Elena that Derek had likely portrayed in their conversations. My phone chimed with a calendar notification. Dinner with Sophie, 6:30 p.m. The reminder of my personal support system provided welcome perspective. Whatever professional challenges I faced during this transition, I would not face them in isolation as I had during the final years of my marriage. I packed my briefcase with materials requiring review, budget projections, staffing analyses, architectural renderings of the proposed expansion, and prepared to leave for the day. As I crossed the executive suite toward the elevators, I noticed several administrative staff members working late, their faces illuminated by computer screens as they focused intently on their tasks. One woman looked up as I passed, offering a tired but genuine smile. "Good night, Ms. Vasquez. It's really good to have you back." Her simple acknowledgement, recognition of my professional value separate from any personal narrative, felt like validation of the choices that had brought me to this moment. I was not Derek's ex-wife here. I was Elena Vasquez, healthcare executive, valued for my expertise and contributions. "Thank you," I replied with equal sincerity. "It's good to be back." Driving home through the autumn twilight, I reflected on the day's experiences, the warm welcomes and operational challenges, the familiar routines and new responsibilities. Cedar Lane Estate waited at the end of my journey, no longer the showcase of Derek's success or the battlefield of our legal separation, but simply my home. A place where I could continue the process of rediscovering and rebuilding myself beyond the constraints of a marriage that had gradually diminished rather than enhanced my identity. As I turned onto the private drive leading to the house, headlights illuminated the property sign I had recently installed. Vasquez Residence, Esther 2025. The date marked not the purchase of the property or the beginning of our marriage, but the moment I had legally reclaimed it as my own, a personal Independence Day commemorating liberation rather than loss. Inside, I moved through my evening routine with deliberate mindfulness, savoring the small freedoms that had once seemed inconsequential, preparing dinner according to my preferences rather than Derek's rigid expectations, playing music he had dismissed as unsophisticated, arranging furniture to prioritize comfort over impressive sightlines for entertaining. After dinner, I settled in the study that had once been Derek's exclusive domain, but now served as my personal workspace. The masculine leather furnishings had been replaced with pieces reflecting my aesthetic preferences. The intimidating desk that had dominated the room now relocated to the garage, awaiting donation. In its place stood a glass-topped writing table that had belonged to my mother, a piece Derek had relegated to storage as too feminine for our home's design scheme. I spread the hospital expansion documents across the table, immersing myself in the project details with professional focus but personal satisfaction. This was work that mattered. Work aligned with my values, leveraging my skills toward meaningful outcomes. The Eastern expansion would increase community access to preventive care, create more efficient clinical workflows, and establish a physical environment more conducive to healing. Around 9, Sophie called as promised, eager to hear about my first day. Her enthusiasm was infectious, her questions insightful. Unlike conversations with Derek, which had inevitably shifted to his priorities and perspectives regardless of the initial topic, Sophie listened actively, engaging with my experiences rather than redirecting to her own. "Have you thought about what you'll do with the rest of the house now?" she asked toward the end of our call. "You've reclaimed the study, but there are a lot of rooms that still feel like before." Her observation was accurate. While I had made changes to the spaces I used most frequently, the kitchen, master bedroom, and study, much of Cedar Lane Estate remained as it had been during my marriage. Derek's design preferences still dominated the formal living areas, His family photographs and memorabilia removed, but not yet replaced with items reflecting my identity. "I'm thinking about it," I acknowledged. "One room at a time." "You should talk to Marcus's partner, Ben," Sophie suggested. "He's an incredible interior designer. Not in a let me impose my vision way, but really collaborative. He did my living room renovation last year." The idea of professional assistance with the house's transformation appealed to me. For so long, home design decisions had been territory for subtle power struggles. Derek presenting his preferences as objective standards of taste, while dismissing my input as quaint or impractical. Working with a professional who would value rather than minimize my aesthetic sensibilities offered an opportunity to address those lingering wounds. "I might do that," I said, noting Marcus's partner's information in my planner. "But first, I need to get through tomorrow's meeting with Dr. James." Sophie's tone sharpened with protective concern. "Derek's golf buddy? The arrogant surgeon?" "The very same." "Want me to accidentally rear-end his BMW in the hospital parking lot?" she offered, only half joking. "I've got excellent insurance." Her fierce loyalty made me laugh, a genuine, unguarded sound that echoed in the study that had once been dominated by Derek's controlling presence. "Thanks for the offer, but I think I can handle one egotistical surgeon. I managed a houseful of them at the fundraising gala last year." After we hung up, I reviewed my notes for the meeting with Dr. James one final time, identifying key data points and potential compromises that would address legitimate clinical concerns while maintaining operational efficiency. Preparation had always been my professional strength, the ability to anticipate objections and develop thoughtful responses before confrontation occurred. Tomorrow would test not just those professional skills, but my personal resilience as well. Dr. James would likely arrive with preconceptions about both my capabilities and character, influenced by whatever narrative Derek had constructed about our separation. My task would be to engage solely on professional grounds, neither defensive about personal matters nor apologetic about professional authority. As I finally prepared for bed, I paused before the bedroom mirror, studying my reflection with objective awareness. The woman looking back at me was neither the carefully curated Mrs. Rodriguez of my marriage, nor the wounded post-surgery version Derek had assumed would be easily manipulated. This Elena, my authentic self emerging from years of subtle suppression, possessed a quiet confidence born of adversity overcome rather than comfort maintained. "You've got this," I told my reflection softly. The simple affirmation feeling, neither forced nor false. One day, one room, one interaction at a time. I straightened my blazer and checked my appearance one final time before my scheduled meeting with Dr. Harrison James. The surgical utilization reports were arranged neatly in a folder on my desk, comprehensive data that would address his concerns about the Eastern Expansion Project with objective facts rather than emotional appeals. I had deliberately chosen a Navy suit that projected authority without ostentation, professional armor for what promised to be a challenging interaction. My assistant Jason knocked precisely at 2:00 p.m. "Dr. James is here for your appointment. Ms. Vasquez." "Please show him in," I replied, moving to stand behind my desk rather than taking the more casual seating arrangement by the window. Some encounters required clear physical positioning, and this was definitely one of them. "Doctor," James entered with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention in any room. At 58, he remained physically imposing, tall, broad-shouldered, with the precise movements of a surgeon accustomed to having his hands treated as valuable instruments. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly when he saw me, surprise, quickly masked by professional courtesy. "Elena," he greeted, extending his hand. "This is an unexpected development." I shook his hand firmly, noting his deliberate use of my first name despite the professional context. "Dr. James, thank you for making time in your surgical schedule for this meeting." He smiled thinly at the subtle reminder of our respective roles. I always make time for administrative discussions that impact patient care, particularly when they involve significant capital expenditure. I gestured toward the chairs positioned at the small conference table in the corner of my office. Please, have a seat. I understand you have concerns about the surgical suite allocation in the Eastern expansion. As we settled at the table, I opened the folder containing utilization data, but Dr. James leaned back in his chair without glancing at the reports. Before we dive into bureaucratic paperwork, I feel I should address the elephant in the room. I kept my expression neutral, though internally I had anticipated this approach. And what elephant would that be, Dr. James? Your situation with Derek. He spoke with the careful precision of someone selecting deliberately neutral terminology. It puts me in an awkward position. Derek has been a friend and investment partner for years. I don't see why my personal circumstances should impact our professional interaction, I replied evenly. We're here to discuss surgical capacity planning for a hospital expansion, not my divorce. His eyebrows rose slightly. You can't seriously believe the two are unrelated. The medical community in Riverside Heights is closely connected. People talk, perceptions matter. I leaned forward slightly, meeting his gaze directly. Which perceptions concern you specifically, Dr. James? That I might be professionally compromised by my divorce? Or that your friendship with my ex-husband might influence your assessment of my capabilities? The directness of my question caught him off guard. James was accustomed to more deferential interactions with hospital administration, particularly from women. His momentary silence confirmed my suspicion that he had expected me to be defensive or apologetic about my personal situation. I'm simply saying that it creates a complex dynamic, he finally offered. Derek has shared certain concerns about your judgment recently. I'm sure he has, I acknowledged calmly. Just as I'm sure you're professional enough to form your own assessments based on evidence rather than hearsay. Speaking of evidence, I slid the utilization reports toward him, redirecting the conversation to substantive matters. These analyses show significant bottlenecks in surgical scheduling that the Eastern expansion will address. For a moment, he seemed prepared to resist this redirection, but professional curiosity ultimately overcame personal agenda. Reluctantly, he began reviewing the data I had prepared, detailed analyses of surgical demand patterns, scheduling inefficiencies, and projected capacity requirements based on community growth forecasts. These projections assume a 12% increase in outpatient procedures over the next 5 years, he observed, tapping a particular graph. That seems optimistic. It's actually conservative compared to national trends, I countered. The aging demographic in our service area suggests potential, growth closer to 18%. We've modeled for the lower figure to ensure sustainable operations even if growth is slower than anticipated. Our discussion gradually shifted from personal undercurrents to professional substance. Whatever James had expected from this meeting, perhaps an emotional confrontation or a display of administrative weakness he could exploit. My thorough preparation and unflappable demeanor had denied him those opportunities. As we explored the technical aspects of surgical suite design and resource allocation, I sensed his reluctant recognition of my expertise. The flow patterns you're suggesting between pre-op and recovery would require additional staffing, he noted after nearly 40 minutes of detailed review. Not necessarily, I replied, turning to a staffing model I had developed. This cross-training approach would allow more flexible deployment of nursing resources while actually improving continuity of care. James studied the model with grudging interest. You've clearly put significant thought into this. That's my job, Dr. James. I allowed a small smile. Just as yours is to provide exceptional surgical care, the Eastern expansion should support that goal, not complicate it. As our meeting concluded, James gathered his notes with a thoughtfulness that suggested recalibration of his initial assumptions. At the door, he paused briefly. Derek mentioned you might be returning to healthcare. He seemed surprised by the development. I maintained my professional composure despite the implicit message. Derek was still discussing me, still attempting to shape narratives about my choices and capabilities. Change often comes with surprises, I replied neutrally. The expansion committee meets next Tuesday at 2 p.m. if you'd like to continue this discussion in the broader planning context. After he left, I remained at my desk, processing the interaction with objective assessment. The meeting had gone better than anticipated, with James gradually engaging with the substantive issues rather than dwelling on personal dynamics. Whether this represented genuine professional respect or merely tactical retreat remained to be seen, but I had established clear boundaries for our future interactions. My phone chimed with a text from Olivia. Court filing deadline approaching. Need your signature on final property transfer docs? Lunch tomorrow? The message was a welcome reminder that the legal chapter of my life was nearly complete. While the emotional and social repercussions of my divorce continued to unfold in encounters like the one with Dr. James, the formal procedures were reaching conclusion. Soon, Cedar Lane Estate would be officially and solely in my name, the property. Records updated to reflect reality rather than Derek's manipulated documentation. We met the following day at a small bistro near Olivia's office. The legal documents carefully organized in a leather portfolio she placed between us after we ordered. These are the final property transfer forms, she explained, opening to flagged signature pages. Once filed, the deed will be recorded solely in your name, with notation regarding the invalidated prior transfer attempt. I signed each page with deliberate attention, the simple act of writing my name representing the culmination of months of legal maneuvering and personal reclamation. Is this the last of it? I asked, completing the final signature. Almost, Olivia replied, sliding another document forward. This acknowledges receipt of your grandmother's ring and formally removes it from the contested property inventory. I paused, surprised that Amber's return of the heirloom had already been incorporated into the legal process. How did you know about the ring? Amber contacted Marcus directly, Olivia explained. Said she wanted to ensure the return was properly documented to prevent any potential legal complications for you. The thoughtfulness of this action, Amber's concern that Derek might somehow use the ring's return against me, suggested a level of ethical awareness I hadn't fully recognized during our conversation. Perhaps there was more genuine remorse in her apology than I had initially credited. That was considerate of her, I acknowledged, signing the acknowledgement. Olivia gathered the documents with practiced efficiency. These will be filed this afternoon. By next week, Cedar Lane Estate will be officially and solely yours. Thank you, I said, the simple words inadequate for expressing my gratitude for Olivia's unwavering support throughout the ordeal. Not just for the legal work, but for believing me when I needed someone to believe me. Her expression softened slightly. You made it easy to believe you, Elena. You had evidence, clear recollection, and logical narrative. But more importantly, you had your own conviction. You never once doubted yourself, even when Derek was working overtime to make you doubt everything. Her observation struck me as both accurate and revelatory. Throughout the legal proceedings, I had indeed maintained absolute certainty about what had happened and what justice required, a clarity that contrasted sharply with the fog of self-doubt that had characterized the later years of my marriage. Somehow Derek's most egregious betrayal had broken the spell of his more subtle manipulations, allowing me to see with perfect clarity what had previously been obscured. Speaking of Derek, Olivia continued, her tone shifting to professional. Alertness. Has he made any contact recently? Not directly, I replied, recounting Dr. James's veiled messages from yesterday's meeting. But he's clearly still discussing me with mutual acquaintances, particularly in professional contexts. Olivia nodded thoughtfully. That's consistent with his pattern. When direct control became impossible, he shifted to narrative control, attempting to shape how others perceive you rather than influencing you directly. "It won't work," I said with quiet confidence. "Not anymore. Not with people who actually work with me." "No," she agreed, "but be prepared for continued attempts. Men like Derek don't surrender control easily, even when legally forced to do so." Her warning resonated with my own instincts. The legal victory, while substantial, represented only one aspect of the separation. The social, professional, and psychological disentanglement would continue indefinitely, requiring ongoing vigilance and boundary maintenance. "I'm prepared," I assured her, and meant it. The following weeks brought rhythms of both novelty and familiarity as I settled into my role at Riverside Memorial. The Eastern Expansion Project gained momentum under my guidance, with even Dr. James grudgingly acknowledging the value of several design modifications I had suggested. Daily operations provided welcome immersion in complex healthcare challenges that engaged my mind fully without the underlying tension that had characterized my work at Rodriguez Development. Home transformation progressed more slowly but with deeply satisfying results. With Ben McAllister's design assistance, Marcus's partner proved to be exactly the collaborative professional Sophie had described. Cedar Lane Estate gradually shed its identity as a showcase for Derek's success and emerged as an authentic reflection of my own aesthetic and functional preferences. We began with the formal living room, replacing the imposing furniture Derek had selected for entertaining important clients, with pieces chosen for both beauty and comfort. The dark, masculine color palette gave way to warmer tones accented with artwork from local artists rather than the generic expensive pieces Derek had purchased primarily for their investment value. "A home should tell your story," Ben observed during our initial consultation. "Not just any story, but the true one." His philosophy resonated deeply with me after years of living in spaces designed to project a carefully curated narrative that had increasingly diverged from reality. Each selection, from the casual sectional sofa that replaced Derek's formal seating arrangement to the handcrafted coffee table sourced from a local woodworker, represented a conscious choice to prioritize authenticity over impression. On a crisp Saturday morning in late October, Sophie arrived with breakfast pastries to check on the renovation progress. We sat in the newly transformed living room, morning sunlight illuminating the space through windows now framed with simple linen draperies rather than the heavy brocade Derek had insisted upon. "It's so different," Sophie marveled, glancing around, "but also somehow exactly right. Like the house is finally showing its true character." "That's what Ben said," I replied, sipping my coffee from a handmade ceramic mug. Another small rebellion against Derek's insistence on using the formal china for even casual gatherings. "That homes should tell true stories." "Speaking of stories," Sophie segued, retrieving her phone, "have you seen the Rodriguez Development website lately?" I shook my head. Following the separation, I had deliberately avoided monitoring Derek's business activities, focusing instead on my own forward momentum. "Why would I look at that?" "Because they've completely rewritten history," Sophie replied, handing me her phone with the site already open. "Look at the leadership page." The screen displayed a professionally photographed portrait of Derek behind his imposing desk, accompanied by a biography that detailed his business accomplishments and community involvement. What caught my attention, however, was the carefully crafted narrative of Rodriguez Development's founding and growth, a narrative that completely omitted my existence, much less my contributions to the company's operational infrastructure. According to this revisionist history, Derek had single-handedly established the company's signature management systems, personally developed relationships with key vendors and clients, and individually created the project tracking methodology. That had become the firm's competitive advantage. All of these had actually been my initiatives, developed during years when Derek focused primarily on acquisition deals, while I managed the operational details he considered beneath his attention. "Wow," I said simply, returning the phone to Sophie. "That's Thorough erasure. Does it bother you? She asked, studying my reaction with sisterly concern. I considered the question carefully, searching for the emotional response such a complete dismissal of my professional contributions might have triggered. Surprisingly, I found neither anger nor indignation, only a calm recognition of the pattern's consistency. Not really, I finally answered. It's exactly what I would expect from him. Sophie's eyebrows rose skeptically. Your ex-husband completely writes you out of the company you helped build for 10 years, takes credit for your work, and you're not even a little annoyed? Oh, I recognize the injustice, I clarified. But being angry about it would require still caring about Rodriguez Development's narrative, still needing recognition within that particular story. I'm writing a different story now. My sister studied me thoughtfully, perhaps assessing whether this equanimity was genuine or a defensive posture. That's remarkably healthy, she finally declared. Suspiciously healthy, actually. Are you secretly planning to hack their website and replace his photo with a potato? The absurd image made me laugh genuinely. No hacking plans, though the potato idea has merit. Our conversation drifted to other topics. Sophie's ongoing renovation of her own condominium, our tentative plans for the upcoming holidays, the book club she had been trying to persuade me to join. The easy exchange, unencumbered by the careful self-censorship that had characterized social interactions during my marriage, reinforced the freedom I had reclaimed along with Cedar Lane Estate. Later that afternoon, as Sophie prepared to leave, she paused in the foyer, her expression turning more serious. I almost forgot to mention, I ran into Diane Matthews at the farmer's market last weekend. The name registered immediately. Derek's administrative assistant who had worked closely with me during my years at Rodriguez Development. Unlike Amber, Diane had maintained professional boundaries, and I had always appreciated her competence and discretion. How is she? I asked, genuinely curious. Looking for a job, Sophie replied. Apparently there have been significant layoffs at Rodriguez Development. The Westfield project failure triggered a financial cascade. The news wasn't entirely surprising, given what Amber had revealed about the company's operational challenges after my departure. But I felt a twinge of concern for the employees affected by Derek's mismanagement. Did she mention who else was let go? Most of the operations team, apparently, Sophie confirmed. She thought you might be interested in knowing that your systems are falling apart without you there to maintain them. She called it organizational karma. The description was apt, if uncomfortable. While I took no pleasure in the company's difficulties, there was undeniable poetic justice in the revelation that the structures and processes Derek had so casually dismissed as administrative details had actually been essential to the firm's functioning. Did she ask you for job leads? I inquired, an idea beginning to form. Sophie nodded. She's exploring options outside real estate development, actually. Said the experience at Rodriguez had soured her on the industry. Would you mind sending me her contact information? We have a senior administrative position opening in strategic planning next month. Her skills might transfer well to healthcare. My sister's expression brightened with approval. Building your own team, are you? I like it. After Sophie left, I spent some time in the garden, clearing away fallen leaves and preparing the rose beds for winter dormancy. The rhythmic, physical work provided space for reflection on the morning's revelations about Rodriguez Development. While Derek attempted to erase my contributions from the company's history, the operational reality was revealing a different truth, one that vindicated my work even as Derek publicly denied its significance. The pattern was familiar from our marriage. Appearances prioritized over substance, image carefully curated while foundation crumbled. For years, I had accepted his framing of reality, doubting my own perceptions when they conflicted with his confident assertions. The clarity that had emerged during our separation, the ability to see situations objectively rather than through the distorting lens of his manipulation, felt like the most valuable asset I had reclaimed. More precious, even than Cedar Lane Estate itself. Monday morning brought a surprise visitor to my hospital office. I had just finished reviewing quarterly budget projections when Jason appeared at my door with an expression of professional neutrality that didn't quite mask his curiosity. "Mr. Victor Patel is here without an appointment," he informed me. "He says it's regarding the Eastern Expansion Project." Victor's appearance was unexpected. While Derek's former business partner had been supportive during the legal proceedings, providing crucial evidence regarding financial improprieties, we had maintained professional distance afterward by mutual, unspoken agreement. His presence at Riverside Memorial suggested either significant development or unusual urgency. "Please show him in," I replied, quickly reorganizing my desk to create a more formal meeting environment. Victor entered with the contained energy that had always characterized his professional demeanor, focused, purposeful, but without Derek's aggressive dominance. At 57, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who measured success by substance rather than appearance. "Elena," he greeted me warmly, accepting my handshake. "Thank you for seeing me without notice. I apologize for the intrusion." "Not at all," I replied, gesturing toward the seating area. "How can I help you, Victor?" He settled into one of the chairs, placing his briefcase carefully beside him. "I've been following news of Riverside Memorial's Eastern Expansion," he began. "The preliminary renderings released last week suggest an ambitious approach to healthcare architecture." I nodded, noting his diplomatic description of designs that had been controversial among some board members precisely because of their innovative elements. "We're trying to rethink the patient experience from the ground up. Healthcare facilities shouldn't feel institutional or intimidating." "That's actually why I'm here," Victor said, opening his briefcase to retrieve a slim folder. "RodCorp Urban Development is interested in partnering with Riverside Memorial on this project." I couldn't completely suppress my surprise. "RodCorp? I wasn't aware you had established a new company." "Recently incorporated," Victor explained. "After the EPA investigation made Rodriguez Development's position untenable, several key investors approached me about salvaging viable projects under new management. RodCorp represents a fresh start with transparent governance and ethical development practices." The implications were significant. Victor had essentially rebuilt from the wreckage of Rodriguez Development, presumably with the same investors who had lost confidence in Derek's leadership. "And Derek? Is he involved with RodCorp?" Victor's expression remained carefully neutral. "Derek is pursuing other opportunities. We negotiated a separation agreement that allows both parties to move forward independently." The diplomatic phrasing suggested a less than amicable business divorce, but I respected Victor's professionalism in avoiding direct criticism. "I appreciate your interest in the expansion project," I said, returning to his original purpose. "However, I should note that my position here creates potential conflict of interest concerns given our previous professional connection." "Precisely why I wanted to speak with you directly before approaching the board," Victor acknowledged. "RodCorp's proposal would be evaluated through the hospital's standard competitive bidding process, with full disclosure of all prior relationships. I wanted to ensure you were comfortable with us submitting a proposal before proceeding." His transparency and ethical awareness contrasted sharply with Derek's approach to business relationships, which had often involved leveraging personal connections to circumvent formal processes. "I appreciate your directness," I replied. "While I'll naturally recuse myself from evaluation decisions regarding RodCorp specifically, I have no objection to your company participating in the bidding process." Victor nodded, seemingly satisfied with this arrangement. "Thank you. We believe our approach to community-integrated development aligns well with Riverside Memorial's mission." As we discussed the expansion project in general terms, timeline, community needs assessment, sustainability goals, I was struck by the comfort of this professional interaction. Unlike my tense meeting with Dr. James or the awkward exchange with Amber, this conversation carried no undercurrents of Derek's continued influence or narrative control. Victor and I had established a new, appropriately bounded relationship based on mutual professional respect rather than shared history. When he prepared to leave, Victor paused briefly. I should mention that RodCorp has hired Diane Matthews as our Director of Operations. She spoke highly of your management systems at Rodriguez Development and has implemented similar approaches in our new organization. The information confirmed what Sophie had relayed about Diane seeking new opportunities after the layoffs. She's an excellent administrator, I acknowledged, very detail-oriented. She also mentioned you might be considering her former colleague for a position here, Victor added with a small smile. Institutional knowledge has value, doesn't it? The comment reflected our shared understanding of what Derek had failed to recognize. Organizations depend as much on operational infrastructure and institutional memory as on charismatic leadership or ambitious vision. It certainly does, I agreed. Please give Diane my regards. After Victor's departure, I contemplated the implications of RodCorp's emergence from Rodriguez Development's decline. There was undeniable symmetry in this development, while I had rebuilt my professional identity. Within healthcare after leaving the company, Victor had essentially rebuilt the company itself after separating from Derek. Both reconstructions represented not mere recovery, but evolution toward more authentic and sustainable forms. That evening, I met with Ben McAllister to review design options for the home office renovation, the next phase in Cedar Lane Estates transformation. As we discussed potential layouts and material selections, my phone chimed with an email notification from an unfamiliar address. Glancing at the preview, I froze momentarily at the sender's name. Derek Rodriguez. Everything okay? Ben asked, noticing my reaction. Just an unexpected email, I replied, setting the phone aside to focus on our design discussion. Nothing urgent. We continued our consultation for another hour, finalizing decisions about desk placement and lighting options for the space that would become my personal work environment at home. After Ben left with our agreed-upon design plan, I finally opened Derek's email, preparing myself for whatever manipulative or confrontational content it might contain. The message was surprisingly brief. Elena, I understand Victor met with you regarding RodCorp's interest in the hospital expansion. While we've had our differences, I want to assure you that my departure from the company was voluntary and mutually beneficial. Should anyone suggest otherwise, particularly in professional contexts, I would appreciate your discretion regarding certain operational challenges that emerged during the transition period. I trust we can maintain professional courtesy despite personal history. Regards, Derek. The carefully worded message revealed more in its subtext than its actual content. Derek was clearly concerned about his professional reputation as news of his separation from Rodriguez. Development circulated through business networks. The reference to operational challenges obliquely acknowledged the system's failures Diane had described while asking me not to discuss them publicly. Most significantly, the email represented Derek's first direct communication since our legal settlement, suggesting he perceived some vulnerability requiring management. After careful consideration, I decided not to respond. Any reply, whether conciliatory or confrontational, would reopen channels of communication that were better left closed. The email itself would be forwarded to Olivia for documentation, but otherwise required no action. Derek's professional reputation would rise or fall based on his own actions, not my commentary. The following day brought another unexpected development, when Grace stopped by my office after the morning leadership meeting. I had an interesting conversation with Franklin Walsh last night, she mentioned casually, referring to the prominent commercial real estate investor I had seen meeting with Victor at Bellamy's months earlier. He's quite impressed with the Eastern expansion concepts. He's seen the preliminary designs? I asked, surprised that the plans had circulated beyond the immediate planning committee. Grace nodded. Apparently, he sits on RodCorp's advisory board now. Victor shared the publicly available renderings with him. He's particularly interested in the community integration aspects. The information provided additional context for Victor's visit. If Walsh was involved with RodCorp, the new company had secured significant financial backing for its fresh start. Walsh has always been interested in developments that enhance community infrastructure rather than just extracting value, I observed, recalling discussions from my Rodriguez development days. He mentioned something else that caught my attention, Grace continued, her tone shifting slightly. Said he had declined to continue working with Derek Rodriguez due to irreconcilable differences in business ethics. Apparently, your ex-husband is finding his options somewhat limited after the EPA situation. The news wasn't entirely surprising, given the seriousness of the Westfield contamination issues, but it confirmed that Derek was experiencing professional consequences beyond the loss of Rodriguez development itself. Financial impropriety tends to make investors nervous, I commented neutrally. Grace studied me thoughtfully. You don't seem particularly satisfied by his difficulties. Most people would feel at least a little vindicated. I considered her observation carefully. Vindication implies I needed external validation of what I already knew to be true, I finally replied. Derek's professional problems aren't my victory or defeat. They're simply the natural consequences of his choices. That's a remarkably centered perspective, Grace noted with approval. One that will serve you well in your role here. Healthcare. Leadership requires exactly that kind of emotional intelligence, recognizing problems without becoming emotionally entangled in them. Her comment highlighted the fundamental difference between my current professional environment and the one I had left behind. At Riverside Memorial, my contributions were evaluated on objective outcomes and demonstrated skills rather than personal relationships or political positioning. My worth wasn't determined by association with Derek or reaction to his actions, but by the measurable impact of my work on organizational effectiveness and patient care. This realization brought a profound sense of peace as I continued through my workday, reviewing department budgets, meeting with architectural consultants, developing implementation timelines for new clinical protocols. Each task represented engagement with substantive challenges rather than navigational exercises through ego-driven power dynamics. The contrast with my final years at Rodriguez Development couldn't have been clearer or more affirming of my decision to return to healthcare. Leadership. That evening, as I drove home along familiar streets now touched with autumn colors, I reflected on the parallel journeys unfolding in the aftermath of my separation from Derek. While I reconstructed my professional identity and personal environment, he apparently faced the dismantling of both his business reputation and social standing. Victor created a new corporate entity emphasizing ethical practices, implicitly distancing himself from Derek's approach. Even Amber had chosen reconstruction, leaving behind the role of accomplice to seek more authentic circumstances. Cedar Lane Estate welcomed me with warm lights I had programmed to activate automatically at dusk, another small reclamation of technology that Derek had previously controlled exclusively. Inside, the gradually transformed spaces reflected my evolving vision for home rather than showcase. Each renovation decision, from paint colors to furniture arrangement, represented a conscious choice rather than passive acceptance of someone else's preferences presented as superior taste. In the kitchen, I prepared a simple dinner while listening to classical music Derek had always dismissed as background noise for people who don't really understand music. The familiar melodies of Bach's cello suites filled the space that had once been dominated by Derek's monologues about business triumphs or social strategies. The contrast, contemplative harmony versus constant self-promotion, seemed the perfect metaphor for the transformation of my daily life. After dinner, I moved to the partially renovated study, settling at my mother's writing desk to review the Eastern Expansion budget proposals. Working from home had once been a constant negotiation with Derek, who viewed any focus on my professional responsibilities as attention diverted from his priorities. Now, I moved freely between work and personal activities, allocating time according to my own judgment rather than someone else's expectations. My phone chimed with a text from Sophie. Book Club Thursday? We're discussing that mystery novel I lent you. No pressure, but everyone's dying to meet the woman who reclaimed her house from beneath her scheming husband. I smiled at her characteristic blend of sisterly support and gentle pushing. The book club represented precisely the kind of social connection Derek had systematically discouraged during our marriage, intellectual engagement with women he had dismissed as not our circle, despite their professional accomplishments and vibrant personalities. Count me in, I replied, realizing I had indeed finished the novel during quiet evenings that were now mine to structure as I pleased. I'll bring dessert. This small commitment, an evening of literary discussion with women I was just beginning to know, symbolized the expanding circles of my reconstructed life. Beyond professional reinvention and home transformation lay the reestablishment of social connections based on genuine interest rather than strategic advantage. Each newly formed relationship represented another thread in the tapestry of identity I was weaving from reclaimed and newly discovered strands. As I prepared for bed that night, moving through my evening routine in spaces increasingly aligned with my authentic preferences, I caught sight of my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me appeared noticeably different, from the carefully maintained Mrs. Rodriguez of my marriage years, not just in the more natural hairstyle or less restrictive clothing, but in the fundamental ease of expression. The tight control that had become habitual under Derek's constant evaluation had given way to something more relaxed and genuine. There you are, I whispered to my reflection, recognizing not a new self emerging from the divorce, but my original self returning after years of gradual suppression. The woman who had once fearlessly managed hospital operations, who had spoken her mind without calculating potential disapproval, who had laughed without monitoring the appropriate volume. That woman had never truly disappeared. She had simply been waiting for the space to reemerge. Cedar Lane Estate was providing that space now. Physical, emotional, psychological room to expand beyond the confines of a relationship that had progressively narrowed rather than enriched my existence. Each transformed room, each independent decision, each unencumbered interaction created more territory for authentic living. As I turned out the lights and settled into bed, the new mattress selected for my comfort rather than Derek's status requirements, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. The legal battle over Cedar Lane Estate had never been primarily about property ownership. It had been about reclaiming the authority to determine my own environment, choices, and ultimately, my own story. Derek had attempted to sell my home while I was on an operating table, believing me too vulnerable to protect myself. Instead, his betrayal had catalyzed a transformation far more significant than either of us could have anticipated. The resurrection of an authentic self that could not be sold, transferred, or diminished by anyone's manipulations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The Eastern Expansion Committee meeting, Diane's job interview, continued home renovations. But I would face each one from this place of hard-won centeredness, not as someone's wife or ex-wife, not as victor or victim in a legal battle, but simply as Elena Vasquez, reclaiming the path I had temporarily left but never completely forgotten. 1 year to the day after my surgery, I stood in the garden of Cedar Lane Estate, watching as caterers arranged tables for the evening's gathering. The anniversary hadn't been consciously planned. Sophie had suggested the date for my housewarming, unaware of its significance until I mentioned it during preparations. Rather than change it, I embraced the symmetry. What better way to mark the day that had begun with betrayal than by celebrating its transformation into opportunity? The renovations were finally complete. Over months of thoughtful redesign with Ben's guidance, Cedar Lane Estate had evolved, from Derek's status symbol into my sanctuary. Each room now reflected my aesthetic and priorities rather than someone else's vision imposed as superior taste. The formal spaces that had once intimidated guests with their calculated perfection now welcomed visitors with comfortable elegance and personal touches. The flowers look beautiful, Grace observed, joining me in the garden. As my mentor and now close friend, she had arrived early to help with final arrangements. Those roses are spectacular. Thank you, I replied, genuinely proud of the garden. I had reclaimed through personal care rather than hired landscapers. They've had a good season. Much like their gardener, Grace noted with characteristic perception. You've bloomed quite remarkably yourself this year. Her observation was accurate but incomplete. The past year had involved less blooming, suggesting beauty emerging from dormancy, and more restoration, like artwork carefully freed from layers of obscuring varnish. The woman hosting tonight's gathering wasn't a new version of Elena, but the original returning after years of gradual suppression. My phone chimed with a text from Olivia. On my way with Marcus and Ben. Need anything? Before I could reply, Sophie emerged from the house carrying champagne flutes on a tray. The ice sculpture is starting to drip in a way that looks vaguely inappropriate, she reported with characteristic candor. Should we move it to the shadier spot? Definitely, I agreed, grateful for her practical perspective. We don't need anatomically suggestive ice features greeting our guests. As we adjusted the arrangements, I felt a profound contentment that had nothing to do with perfection. Unlike gatherings during my marriage, when Derek had demanded flawless execution to impress important connections, tonight's celebration embraced the beautifully imperfect reality of genuine hospitality. If ice sculptures melted suggestively or flower arrangements shifted asymmetrically, these would become charming anecdotes rather than failures requiring damage control. Guests began arriving at 7, forming a deliberately eclectic mix that would have horrified Derek with its lack of strategic purpose. Hospital colleagues mingled with neighbors, book club members chatted with Sophie's artist friends, and professional connections engaged with family acquaintances. There was no hierarchy, no VIP section, no calculated seating arrangement designed to facilitate advantageous introductions. Diane Matthews arrived with Victor Patel, both now thriving in their roles at RodCorp. After joining me briefly to admire the renovated living room, Diane moved toward the garden, leaving Victor and me in momentary private conversation. The transformation is remarkable, he observed, glancing around the space that had once showcased Derek's priorities, both the home and its owner. Thank you for coming, I replied sincerely. It means a lot to have you here. His smile conveyed understanding of the significance. Victor's presence represented continuity without compromise, recognition of shared history without entanglement in its more painful aspects. RodCorp was awarded the Eastern expansion contract, he mentioned quietly. The board made their decision yesterday. Congratulations, I responded with genuine pleasure. The proposal was excellent. I'm glad the review committee recognized its merits. I had recused myself from the selection process, but the committee's decision validated Victor's ethical rebuilding efforts. We're announcing a new community commitment alongside the project, he added. 10% of proceeds will fund healthcare, access programs for underserved neighborhoods. I thought you might appreciate knowing that before it becomes public. The initiative reflected precisely the values-driven approach that had been missing from Rodriguez development, prioritizing community benefit alongside profit rather than treating social impact as merely an obligatory marketing exercise. That's wonderful, Victor. Truly. As more guests arrived, our conversation shifted to general pleasantries before Victor moved toward the garden to join other guests. I greeted Dr. James and his wife as they entered, noting how our professional relationship had evolved from initial tension to cautious respect over months of collaboration on the expansion project. While never becoming friendly, we had established a functional collegiality based on shared commitment to improving patient care. Lovely home, Mrs. James commented, glancing around with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating properties. You've done remarkable things with it since I last visited during one of Derek's business dinners. Thank you, I replied simply, accepting both the compliment and its implicit acknowledgement of transformation. Please help yourselves to refreshments in the garden. As the evening progressed, I moved among my guests with a genuine ease that contrasted sharply with the calculated social performance Derek had expected at such gatherings. Rather than monitoring for potential business advantages or status enhancements, I simply enjoyed meaningful connections with people whose company I valued. Near 9 o'clock, Sophie clinked her glass for attention, drawing guests into a loose circle in the garden. "I'd like to propose a toast," she announced, raising her champagne flute toward me. "To my incredible sister, who didn't just reclaim a house, but rebuilt a home and a life authentically her own. Your strength has been an inspiration, Elena." Glasses raised around the garden as murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. The genuine warmth in my guests' expressions, so different from the calculated appreciation at Derek's strategic events, touched me deeply. "Thank you all for being here," I responded simply. "This home's true value lies in the friends and family who fill it with genuine connection. I'm grateful for each of you." As conversations resumed and guests dispersed throughout the garden and house, Olivia approached with a subtle gesture indicating private information to share. We moved toward a quieter corner of the terrace, where she spoke quietly despite the ambient noise of the party. "I thought you should know, Derek filed for bankruptcy yesterday. Personal, not just business." Her expression conveyed professional neutrality with a hint of satisfaction. The EPA fines and investor lawsuits finally caught up with him. The news registered as significant information rather than emotional catalyst. A year earlier, I might have felt vindication, or perhaps even sympathy. Now, I simply acknowledged it as the natural consequence of choices Derek had made long before our separation. "Where does that leave Amber?" I asked, remembering our unexpectedly meaningful conversation months earlier. "She protected herself. Legally before leaving," Olivia assured me. "Smart woman, once she saw clearly. She's working for a nonprofit housing organization now, apparently." Our conversation was interrupted as Ben approached with Marcus, both carrying dessert plates and wearing expressions of architect-designer excitement that inevitably preceded discussion of some new project or renovation possibility. "We were just discussing the pool house," Ben announced, gesturing toward the small structure visible at the garden's edge. "It has amazing potential as a studio space." "Or guest quarters," Marcus added. "The southern exposure is perfect." Their enthusiasm made me smile. The pool house, a space Derek had used primarily for storing expensive outdoor furniture during winter months, had been the one area we hadn't addressed in the renovation. "I'm open to suggestions," I replied. "Though perhaps we should discuss it when you're not technically guests at my party." The remainder of the evening unfolded with natural warmth and genuine connection. As midnight approached and the last guests departed, Sophie and I moved through the garden collecting abandoned glasses and rearranging furniture disturbed during the celebration. "Successful party," she declared, collapsing onto a garden bench, with satisfied exhaustion. Not a single passive-aggressive comment about wine selection or inappropriate political discussion. "Derek would be so disappointed," I laughed, joining her on the bench. "The shocking absence of networking opportunities alone would devastate him." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, appreciating the garden's beauty under subtle landscape. Lighting. Fireflies danced among the roses, adding natural magic to the scene that no professional event planner could have arranged. "Are you happy, Elle?" Sophie finally asked, using the childhood nickname that had disappeared during my marriage. "Truly happy, I mean." The question deserved thoughtful consideration. "I'm content," I replied after a moment. "Engaged with meaningful work, connected to people I value, living in a space that reflects rather than constrains me." I paused, searching for the right words. "It's less about happiness as a destination and more about authenticity as a practice." Sophie nodded slowly. "That sounds sustainable and real." "It is," I confirmed, recognizing the profound truth. In this simple assessment, sustainable reality had replaced performative perfection in every aspect of my life: professional, personal, and physical. Cedar Lane Estate now existed as genuine sanctuary rather than showcase, its beauty arising from authentic expression rather than status calculation. As Sophie departed for her own home an hour later, I moved through the quiet rooms of Cedar Lane Estate with a sense of peaceful ownership that transcended legal documentation. This house, once Derek's family legacy and later the battlefield of our separation, had finally completed its transformation into my authentic home. In the study that had once been Derek's exclusive domain but now served as my personal workspace, I paused before the wall where his grandfather's imposing portrait had once dominated. In its place hung a simple collection of photographs representing my journey: my hospital administration ceremony, hiking with Sophie in the mountains, my father teaching me to plant roses, my mother at her writing desk. Beside these hung a small, elegant shadow box containing the key Ben had created during the renovation, a symbolic replacement for the originals Derek had initially refused to surrender. The custom-designed key featured a rose motif on its handle, representing both the garden I had nurtured and the growth that had emerged from challenging circumstances. The Eastern Expansion Project architectural rendering completed the display, a professional accomplishment representing not just career advancement, but purposeful engagement with work aligned with my core values. The healthcare facility taking shape under my guidance would serve community needs for decades, embodying the principle that structures should enhance human experience rather than merely impress observers. As I prepared for bed, I noted with quiet satisfaction that no part of this evening's experience had been diminished by thoughts of Derek, or how he might have managed things differently. His absence from my life had long since ceased to feel like loss and now registered simply as clarity, the removal of distorting influence that had gradually obscured my authentic perspective. Tomorrow would bring hospital meetings and expansion project updates, dinner with book club friends, perhaps sometime in the garden before autumn fully claimed the landscape. Each activity represented a chosen commitment rather than obligation. Each relationship existed for its inherent value rather than strategic advantage. The calendar filling with such engagements reflected not busy distraction, but purposeful connection. 1 year after waking from surgery to discover betrayal, I rested in a home reclaimed and rebuilt according to my own vision. The journey from that vulnerable moment to this peaceful night had traversed legal battles and emotional reckonings, professional reinvention, and personal restoration. Each challenge had revealed strength I had temporarily forgotten, but never truly lost. Cedar Lane Estate stood solid around me, its century-old foundations outlasting the man who had thought it was his to discard. In the quiet darkness, I acknowledged a truth that felt both powerful and peaceful. Some things, once truly claimed, cannot be sold or transferred by anyone's deception. Some foundations, once properly built, support not just houses, but lives, of authentic purpose and meaningful connection. The home I had fought to keep now sheltered a woman who had finally, completely, come home to herself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.